Hey there and welcome back. If you have found your way here at the close of a long day, the lamps turned low, and the noise of everything finally beginning to settle, then you have come to exactly the right place. Tonight, we are going back into the candlelit drawing rooms of Regency London, into a society of glittering parties and whispered scandal and aching, reckless feeling, to spend a few unhurried hours in the company of a woman the entirety of fashionable England could not stop talking about, and has never quite stopped talking about since. Let your shoulders come down from where the day has lifted them. Let your breathing slow. Nothing is asked of you in what follows but to listen and to drift. By the time we reach the end of her life, you will understand how a clever, dazzling, impossible girl came to write 3 small words about a famous poet that have outlived nearly everything else she ever did, and how those same 3 words in the end helped to ruin her. Before we step inside, I would love to know where in the world you are listening from tonight, and what the hour is where you are. Whether it is late evening where you are, or the very small hours, whether there is rain at the window or only the quiet dark, you are welcome to leave it below if you feel like it, because I do read what you write, and there's again something companionable in knowing the places these stories travel out to. If these long evenings of history are something you would like to find your way back to, you are welcome to subscribe, and then the next one will come and find you. There is no urgency in any of it. Just settle yourself in, and let me take you back, now. Picture London in the 1780s, in the high noon of the Georgian age, a city of soot and candlelight and carriages, and at the very centre of its fashionable life, a grand house on the edge of the green expanse of the park, its windows blazing into the night. This is Devonshire House, the headquarters of the Whig aristocracy, the most glamorous and most talked about household in England, presided over by the famous and beautiful Duchess of Georgiana, whose face is on each print in every shop window. Into this world, into this dazzling, restless, emotionally tangled circle of cousins and lovers and politicians and wits, a little girl is born in the November of the year 1785. Her name is Caroline Ponsonby. She is the niece of the famous Duchess, and she has arrived, though no one can know it yet, into precisely the wrong age for a child of her particular gifts, a realm that will adore her, and dazzle her, and form her, and in the end destroy her. Come closer. This is where it begins. To understand Caroline, you must first understand the family she was born into, because it was unlike almost any other in England, and it left its mark on her as surely as a seal pressed into hot wax. Her father was Frederick Ponsonby, the Earl of Bessborough, a decent and rather ordinary man largely overshadowed by the women around him. Her mother was Henrietta Frances Spencer, known to everyone as Harriet, and Harriet was the younger sister of Georgiana, the Duchess of Devonshire herself. So Caroline grew up not on the edge of that famous golden circle, but squarely inside it, a small bright presence in rooms that the whole nation read about in the newspapers. Her aunt was the most celebrated woman in England, a leader of fashion, a political hostess, a creature of legend, and also a woman whose own life was a tangle of debt and gambling, complicated love that the child Caroline absorbed simply by breathing the air of those rooms. Her mother, Harriet, was herself one of the most charming and most reckless women of that charming, reckless circle, devoted and unreliable by turns, given to grand passions and grand debts and grand illnesses, loving her children genuinely, and raising them haphazardly in the manner of her class and her temperament, and the famous Duchess presided over the whole of it like a beautiful troubled goddess, adored by the nation, drowning in secret debt, sharing her own household with her husband's mistress in an arrangement that scandalized and fascinated all England. These were the women who formed Caroline's first idea of what a woman's life could be, brilliant and emotional and undisciplined and perpetually on the edge of some delicious catastrophe, and a watchful, imaginative child raised among them absorbed, long before she could judge it, the conviction that this was simply how remarkable women lived, at the very pitch of feeling, heedless of consequence, beautiful and doomed. She had, in a sense, no chance. The pattern was set in the nursery, drawn from the very people she most loved, and she would spend her life living it out to its conclusion. This was a family in which the adults loved passionately and behaved badly, and forgave one another endlessly, in which feeling was prized above all but everything and discretion above almost nothing, and a sensitive, watchful little girl learned her first lessons about how the world worked by watching the beautiful, reckless people who surrounded her. Let me set you down in that house for a moment, because to picture it is to begin to understand her. Devonshire House stood behind a high blank wall on the edge of the green park, plain and scarcely forbidding from the street, and then you passed through the gate and the courtyard and up the great staircase, and the whole glittering interior opened around you like a jewel box. The rooms hung with silk and crowded with the most fashionable, most powerful, most beautiful people in England. The talk was of politics and of love, often indistinguishably, for the Whig grandees who gathered there made and unmade ministries between the card tables and conducted their tangled romances in full view of one another with a frankness that scandalized the rest of the country. Money ran through it like water and ran out as fast, swallowed by the gaming tables at which the vast ladies lost fortunes in a night. And through these rooms, underfoot and overindulged, ran a small, fair, clever child, watching it all, drinking it in, learning that this was what life looked like at the top of the circle, learning that feeling was the only thing that truly mattered, and that rules were for other, duller people. It was an extraordinary education, and an extraordinary dangerous one. She was, from the very beginning, an unusual child, and the family knew it. She was quick and imaginative and intensely emotional, given to flights of wild high spirits and to sudden plunges of despair, a creature of extremes in a family that already ran rather warm. She felt everything more than other children seemed to, loved harder, raged harder, wept harder, and was enchanting and exhausting by turns. The adults around her, who were themselves not models of steadiness, looked on this vivid little granddaughter of the Spencers with a mixture of delight and faint alarm, and they did what fashionable families of that age so often did with a difficult, dazzling child. They let her run. There was no firm hand, no patient schooling of the temper, no quiet insistence that feeling must sometimes be governed. There was instead indulgence and laughter at her cleverness, and a general assumption that Caro, as they called her, was simply Caro, a law unto herself, to be adored rather than disciplined. It is one of the small tragedies of her story that the very milieu that found her so charming was the world least equipped to give her what she most needed, which was someone to teach her gently and early how to live inside her own enormous feelings without being swept away by them. What a child like that needs is not less love, but a steadier kind, the unglamorous daily love that sets limits and keeps promises and teaches, by patient repetition, that the set is safe and that feeling, however large, can be survived. She got instead the dazzling intermittent love of beautiful distracted people, adoring her one moment and forgetting her the next, indulging her tantrums because they were charming and ignoring her terrors because they were inconvenient. Such love, for all its warmth, leaves a particular wound, the wound of the child who can never be sure of being held, who learns that affection is dazzling but undependable, who grows up reaching always for a reassurance that was never quite reliably given. Caroline carried that wound out of the nursery and into each room she ever entered, and it is there, in the glittering, careless tenderness of Devonshire House, that all of her later tragedy is already, quietly, present. For a time in her childhood, she was taken abroad. Her mother's health and her mother's complicated life carried the family across to the continent, to Italy among other places, and the young Caroline spent formative years in a loose, wandering, unstructured existence, soaking up languages and impressions and the romance of foreign cities, but acquiring very little of the ordinary discipline that a more settled upbringing might have pressed upon her. She read voraciously and unsystematically, whatever caught her flying imagination. Those continental years left their colour on her for the rest of her life. Picture the household pitching up in Italy, in the bright hard sunlight of the south, the family installed for months at a stretch in rented rooms with marble floors and shutters drawn against the afternoon heat, and a thin, restless English child set loose among it with almost no one minding where she went or what she did. She picked up Italian from the servants and French from her mother's circle, and a magpie's hoard of poetry and song from whoever would recite to her. She watched the religious processions wind through narrow streets, the candles and the painted saints carried shoulder high, and she absorbed, without anyone meaning to teach it, the taste for spectacle and high feeling, and the theatrical pitch of southern life that her chillier homeland would never quite satisfy again. There were no fixed hours, no schoolroom discipline, no governess, patient enough to hold her to a task. She learned what delighted her, and ignored what bored her, and what delighted her was always the vivid, the dramatic, the romantic, the tale of doomed lovers and tragic queens. By the time the family came north again, she had been formed past changing, a creature of impulse and imagination with a head full of poetry and a heart trained from infancy to reach for the heightened and the extreme. There is a story, very likely true, that the family physician, despairing of ever bringing the wild little girl to any settled course of lessons, advised simply that she be left alone, that nothing be forced upon her, that she be allowed to follow her own bent wherever it led. Whether or not the advice was given in quite those words, it describes perfectly the upbringing she in fact received. No one made her sit still. No one made her finish what she had begun, or master the dull foundations on which a disciplined mind is built, or learn the patient self-command that is the only real protection a passionate nature ever has against itself. She picked up French and Italian practically by ear, soaked up poetry and romance and history in vast undigested drafts, formed quick, brilliant opinions about everything and the habit of patience about nothing. By the time she was grown, she had the knowledge of a clever woman and the discipline of a spoiled child, and the gap between the two would prove, across her whole life, to be the exact measure of her unhappiness. She was clever far beyond her schooling, full of poetry and quick opinions and theatrical feeling, and almost entirely without the steadying ballast of routine. Picture her at 9 or 10, a slight, restless, fair-haired child with enormous expressive eyes, holding forth in 2 or 3 languages, adored by the servants, indulged by the adults, already half in love with the idea of grand passions and tragic heroines and lives lived at the very pitch of feeling. She was being formed, day by day, into someone exquisitely sensitive and exquisitely unprepared, a girl built to feel the society intensely and never taught how to bear the weight of feeling it so much. And underneath the brightness there ran, even then, something fragile, something the age had no kind word for and certainly no understanding of. There were moods in her that went beyond ordinary childish temper, swings of exhilaration and darkness that frightened those around her, and that she could not herself explain or control. We would think about such things very differently now, with more knowledge and, one hopes, but she was a child of the 1790s, and the people around her had only the crude vocabulary of their time, of a girl who was highly strung, or willful, or simply too much. And so the thing in her that most needed care and understanding was the very thing her world was least able to recognize. One of the kinder offices of looking back across 2 centuries is that we can extend such a child the understanding her own age could not. Where they saw willfulness, we might see a mind that processed feeling differently and more intensely than most, through no fault and no choice of its own. Where they saw a difficult temper to be indulged or scolded, we might see a real vulnerability that called for care. None of this is to drain her of responsibility for the harm she would later do, for she was not a mere puppet of her nature, and she made choices, some of them cruel, for which the people she hurt paid dearly. But it is to insist that the story of Caroline Lamb is not, at bottom, the story of a bad woman, but the story of a vulnerable one set down in a sphere with neither the knowledge nor the patience to help her, and left to make her own way through a life that asked of her exactly the steadiness she had never been given the means to build. Hold that in your mind as we go forward, because it is the quiet thread running underneath everything that is to come. The gifted, vivid, unsteady girl, set loose in the most glamorous and least careful society in England, and left to find her own way through feelings far too large for anyone, let alone a child, to manage alone. As she grew towards womanhood, Caroline came home to take her place in the great glittering machine of fashionable London, and it is worth pausing to feel what that age was actually like, because she was about to be poured into it like a wild river into a very narrow channel. The society she entered, the world we now call the Ton, was small, brilliant, and merciless. A few hundred families held the entirety of fashionable England between them, and they spent the season circling one another through an endless round of balls and dinners and morning calls and evenings at the opera, watching, judging, and remembering everything. It was a realm that ran on appearance and on the most exquisite reading of surfaces, in which a glance held too long or a name spoken in the wrong tone could undo a reputation, and in which women, above all, were watched with a particular and unforgiving attention. A woman in that circle was expected to be charming but never conspicuous, to feel but never to show too much, to draw admiration, and then to manage it with perfect invisible skill. She was to be a polished surface on which the society could admire its own reflection. Everything in a young woman's life was bent towards the single famous transaction of marriage, and the elaborate machinery of the season existed beneath its glitter to bring that transaction off. The balls were marriage markets, the careful introductions were negotiations. The whole apparatus of chaperones and morning calls and correctly graduated warmth was a system for matching property to property and bloodline to bloodline, with the least possible interference from anything so unreliable as love. A girl was a piece in this game, valuable for her connections and her fortune and her unblemished name, and her chief duty was to keep that name unblemished until it could be exchanged in marriage for a husband and a settled place. And the cruelest feature of that complete arrangement was the asymmetry of its mercy, for a young man might sow what wild oats he pleased and come to the marriage market with his value undiminished, while a young woman who made a single false step, or was merely thought to have made one, found her value gone beyond recovery, her name spoiled, her prospects ruined, the whole of her future forfeit for an error a man would have been forgiven in an afternoon. A woman's reputation was a thing of glass, infinitely precious and infinitely fragile, and once cracked it could never be mended. A man's was made of sterner and more forgiving stuff. Caroline grew up inside this iron rule without ever, perhaps, fully grasping how absolute it was, protected by her youth and her connections from feeling its full weight, until the day came when she broke it past all repair and discovered, too late, exactly how unforgiving the world could be to a woman who had spent the one coin she was never permitted to spend twice. Feeling in such a system was at best an irrelevance and at worst a danger, and a young woman who felt too much, who let her heart stray from the path of advantage, who risked her one precious asset of reputation for the sake of mere emotion, was not merely foolish, but a threat to the entire careful order. Caroline, who lived for feeling, was born to be exactly such a threat. And it is worth pausing to take in just how narrow the legal and practical cage was that enclosed a woman of her time, because it shaped everything that happened to her. A married woman, in the England of those years, had in the eyes of the law virtually no separate existence at all. Her property became her husband's on the wedding day. Her earnings, had she any, were his. The very children of her body were his in law, to be kept or removed at his discretion, with no claim she could enforce against him. She could not vote, could not sit in any parliament or hold any office, could not enter the professions, could not, in any respectable way, earn her own bread or order her own life. Marriage was very nearly the only career open to a woman of her class, and once she had embarked on it she was bound for life, for divorce was a thing so costly and so scandalous as to be effectively impossible, requiring in practice an Act of Parliament, and available, in any real sense, only to men. A wife who found herself wretched had, in plain terms, almost nowhere to go and nearly nothing to do. She could not leave, could not work, could not start again, could only endure, or rebel and be ruined. Set against that airless confinement, the recklessness of women like Caroline begins to look less like mere wickedness and more like the thrashing of a creature with too much life in it for the box it had been nailed into. She had been given a vivid, hungry, powerful nature, and then placed in a cage that allowed it no outlet but scandal, and when inevitably the nature broke the bars, the same society that had built the cage stood back and called her mad. You can already sense the problem. Into this milieu of polished surfaces came a young woman whose entire nature was the opposite of a polished surface, who felt everything visibly and immediately, who could not for the life of her pretend to a coolness she did not possess, who said the startling true thing when she was meant to say the smooth, empty thing, and who carried into every drawing-room a charge of feeling that drew people irresistibly towards her and made the careful guardians of propriety deeply nervous. She was magnetic. People who met the young Caroline came away talking about her wit, her strangeness, her quicksilver changes of mood, the way she could make an ordinary evening suddenly feel like the most important night of your life. The fashionable set that received her had its own formidable temple, the assembly rooms at Almack's, where the patronesses, a handful of formidable ladies, decided with absolute power who should be admitted and who shut out, and to be granted, the precious voucher was to be certified as belonging, and to be refused, it was a kind of social death. All of the season turned on such tiny, mercilessly policed gradations, the right introductions, the right invitations, the correct degree of warmth in a deep lady's nod. Into this exquisitely calibrated machine came Caroline, who had never in her life been taught to calibrate anything, who said what she felt and felt what she said and trusted, with the fatal confidence of the indulged, that her own charm would carry her over each rule. For a while it did. She was too well connected, too clever, too magnetic to be easily refused. But the rules were watching her even as they admitted her, and a world that lives by rules never forgets the one who flouts them, and stores up the memory of every transgression against the day it will be needed. She was also, by the rigid measure of the ton, dangerous, because she did not obey the rules, and a society built on rules is always frightened of those who cannot or will not keep them. To feel the cage she was placed in, you have to picture the machinery of the season at close range, and there is no better place to start than the assembly rooms in King Street that the fashionable called Almack's. Wednesday by Wednesday through the spring, the carriages drew up outside its plain frontage and discharged the cream of society into rooms that were by any honest reckoning rather bare, the dancing floor chalked with patterns, the band playing from a gallery, the supper notoriously thin, dry bread and butter, and stale cake and weak tea and a tepid almond drink, served as if to remind the company that one did not come here to eat. One came to be seen, and to be admitted at all was the whole point. Entry was controlled by a committee of grand ladies, the patronesses, half a dozen of the most powerful women in England, who decided by private vote who should receive a voucher and who should be turned from the door, and whose word was final and beyond appeal. A young woman refused her voucher might as well have left the country. To hold one was to be inside the charmed circle. To lose one was social death, announced to all the watching town. Within those rooms the rituals were exact and unforgiving. A gentleman who arrived after the doors were shut at 11 was sent away though he were a duke. The dances were prescribed, the partners arranged, the conversation kept to a careful shallow brilliance, and over the entire performance the patronesses presided like priestesses of a religion whose single commandment was decorum. It was here and in 100 drawing rooms like it that the real business of the fashionable sphere was transacted, the marriages made, the reputations weighed, the newcomers measured and approved or quietly destroyed. And a girl was expected to navigate it flawlessly, to read its 1,000 unwritten signals, to please without seeming to try, to attract without ever appearing to want, and above all never to let the mask slip and show what she actually felt. Beyond the fierce set-piece evenings, the season had its daily rhythm too, and that rhythm was its own kind of performance. The fashionable rose late and breakfasted towards noon, and then the day unfolded through its appointed stages. There were the morning calls, paid and received according to an exact etiquette, the cards left, the brief visits made, the whole town quietly taking stock of who was received where and on what terms. There was the afternoon promenade, the ritual circuit of the park at the fashionable hour, when the carriages and the riders turned out in their finery to see and be seen, to bow and be bowed to register in 100 tiny exchanges the standing of everyone present. To be greeted warmly by the right people in that public arena was to have one's place confirmed, to be cut, to have a once friendly face turned deliberately away, was a public humiliation witnessed by the whole of one's world. Every outing was an examination, each encounter a small test, passed or failed, and a woman learned to read the temperature of her own reputation in the warmth or coolness of the nods she gathered on a single afternoon's drive. It was a life lived entirely in the open, under perpetual observation, governed by rules no one had ever written down, and everyone was expected to know, and it suited exactly those temperaments that found safety in surfaces, and ruined those that did not. Caroline, who could no more manage a surface than fly, moved through this daily examination forever, on the edge of failing it, and the watching age, which forgave so much done in private, was already beginning to mark her down. Picture her then, at 17, at 18, slight and fair and almost boyish in figure, with those great dark expressive eyes and a low musical voice, moving through the candle-lit rooms of Whig London like a creature not quite of that realm. Those who met her in those years reached ever afterward for the same handful of impressions, and never quite agreed. She was too thin for the fashion, boyish, her figure with none of the soft fullness the age admired, and yet there was something about her that drew every eye in a room and held it. Her hair was cropped short and curled close to her head, which was itself a kind of declaration in a world of elaborate coiffure. Her voice was low and oddly musical, with a lisp that some found enchanting and others affected, and she used it to say things that no other young woman of her standing would have dared to say aloud, sudden, true, sharp things that cut through the polite haze and left her hearers half delighted and half appalled. She could be, in the space of an hour, dazzling and tiresome, generous and impossible, the wittiest person at the table, and then, without warning, plunged into a misery she made no effort to hide. People who disliked her called her affected, a poseur forever acting some part. People who loved her insisted that the very opposite was true, that the trouble with Caroline was that she could not act at all, that where everyone else wore a smooth social mask, she went barefaced through the circle, each feeling legible, nothing concealed. Both camps were describing the same thing from opposite sides. She was a person without a surface, in a society that was all surface, and that single fact would prove, in time, to be the hinge on which her whole fate turned. If the assembly rooms were the daylight face of the season, the theatre and the opera were its glamorous evening counterpart, and they too formed a stage on which the fashionable performed for one another quite as much as the players performed for them. A great lady went to the opera less to hear the music than to be seen hearing it, installed in her box like a jewel in a setting, surveying the house through her glass, and being surveyed in turn. The boxes themselves a kind of vertical map of who stood where in the order of things. Between the acts the visiting began, gentlemen moving from box to pay their court, gossip carried along the tiers like a current. The playhouses at Drury Lane and Covent Garden drew the same brilliant, restless crowd, who talked through the scenes they found dull and wept extravagantly through the ones they found affecting. This was an age that prized the open display of feeling in its art, even as it punished the open display of feeling in its women. Caroline loved all of it. The lights, the music, the heightened emotion of the stage, the sense of life lifted for an evening above the ordinary. The theatricality of the theatre answered something deep in her, in a nature that was itself forever dramatizing, forever casting the events of her own life as scenes in some grand unfolding play. She was, in a sense, always at the theatre, even when she was nowhere near one, always watching herself move through a story, and the actual playhouse merely gave open license to a habit of mind that governed her total existence. It was a dangerous gift, this instinct to live as though performing, for a person who cannot stop turning her life into theatre will in the end mistake a real catastrophe for a thrilling final act, and play it to the hilt, and bring the curtain down on herself. The people who knew her left their impressions scattered through the letters and memoirs of the age, and taken together they compose a portrait far richer than the caricature that swallowed her. They wrote of her astonishing changeability, of a woman who could hold a room enraptured, and then, an hour later, reduce it to embarrassed silence. They wrote of her kindness, the impulsive, open-handed generosity that her detractors never mentioned, the way she would take up a cause or a person with sudden fierce loyalty. They wrote, too, of how exhausting she could be, how the very intensity that made her fascinating made her, in the end, a strain on the patience of those who loved her best. The shrewd ones saw early what was coming. The fond ones excused her past all reason. The cruel ones sharpened their wit on her and stored their best lines for their letters. What all but none of them managed in their own time was to set the contradictions side by side and see that they were not contradictions at all, but the single inseparable truth of a complicated human being, brilliant and tiresome, generous and impossible, deeply loving and deeply unwell, all at once and all the time. It would take the colder, fairer eye of later generations to assemble those scattered glimpses into something like a whole person, and even now the assembling is not finished. There was something faintly androgynous about her that fascinated her contemporaries, a slenderness, an almost elfin quality, a way of seeming younger and stranger and less substantial than the handsome, well-fed women of fashion around her, as though she were made of some lighter and more volatile material. She was no conventional beauty, and she knew it, and she made of her unconventionality a style entirely her own, dressing to suit her slight figure, cultivating an air of fey originality that drew the eye more surely than mere prettiness ever could. People remembered her appearance the way one remembers a strange and striking face in a crowd, not for its perfection but for its singularity, for the sense it gave of a spirit too large and too restless for the delicate frame that housed it. Everything about her, even her body, seemed to declare that here was someone who did not fit the ordinary moulds, who could not be measured by the ordinary standards, and who would have to be, for better and for terrible worse, entirely and only herself. She danced, she talked brilliantly, she charmed, and underneath it she watched and felt and longed, full of a vague, enormous hunger for some life larger and more vivid than the one the season was offering her. There was a quality in her that everyone who met her tried afterward to describe and no one quite captured, a kind of electric immediacy, a sense that, with Caroline, you were never on the safe, dull ground of ordinary social exchange, but always on the edge of something, that anything might be said, anything felt, anything done. It made her dangerous company and irresistible company at once. Dull people found her exhausting, and were a little afraid of her. Clever people found her the most alive presence in any room, the one who made everyone else seem to be sleepwalking. She had read everything and would argue anything, would turn a polite dinner into a real conversation by the sheer force of caring about what was said, would fix you with those great dark eyes as though you were, for that moment, the only person in the world worth her entire attention. It was a gift, that intensity, a rare and genuine gift, and in a kinder world it might have made her a great hostess, a real writer, a force at anything. In the world she actually inhabited, it made her, in the end, a great cautionary tale. She had grown up on poetry and grand passion and the romance of the continent, and now she found herself expected to settle into the small, careful gestures of fashionable courtship, the managed flirtations, the suitable marriage that would be arranged in due course. Something in her resisted it without quite knowing how to resist it, reached for something it could not name, and the people who loved her watched with that familiar mixture of delight and unease, wondering perhaps what would become of a girl so very much alive in a society that so prized the appearance of calm. And then into this restless, watchful, hungry life there came a young man who seemed for a while to be the answer to everything. He was clever, he was kind, he was ambitious, he was utterly unlike the brittle, fashionable men around her, and his name was William Lamb. He would, in the fullness of an extraordinary life, become Prime Minister of England, and the trusted mentor of a young queen. But all of that lay far in the unimaginable future. For now he was simply a brilliant, easy-going, faintly cynical young man with his way to make in the world, and he looked at the strange, dazzling girl from Devonshire House and saw, where others saw danger, something rare and worth winning. We are going to him next, to the love match that everyone thought so promising, and that carried inside it, from the very first, the seeds of so much sorrow. William Lamb was a younger son, and in the England of that age, a younger son was a particular kind of creature, raised among the famous and the rich, but not himself the heir to very much, obliged to make his own way by his wits and his charm and his connections. He had both wit and charm in abundance. He was clever in an easy, unforced way, widely read, sceptical, amused by the sphere, blessed with a temperament about as far from Caroline's as it was possible to be. For where she felt everything to the point of agony, he seemed to glide over the surface of life with a tolerant half-smile, taking little too seriously, least of all himself. He came, too, from a remarkable family. His mother, Lady Melbourne, was one of the shrewdest and most worldly women in England, a political operator and a famous wit, a woman who understood the formidable game of society better than scarcely anyone, and who would, as it happened, come to play her own quiet part in the drama that lay ahead. She deserves a closer look, this mother-in-law, because she is one of the most formidable figures in the whole story, and one of the least sentimental women of her age. Lady Melbourne had risen and prospered by understanding exactly how the age worked and never once allowing her heart to overrule her head. She had managed her own marriage, her own liaisons, and her own family's advancement with a cool, unblinking competence that her society both feared and admired, and she regarded feeling, the very thing her future daughter-in-law lived for, as a weakness to be managed rather than a value to be served. You can imagine then how these two women struck against one another from the start, the older one all calculation and the younger all impulse, the one who governed her passions and the one who was governed by hers. Lady Melbourne looked at Caroline and saw a danger to her cherished son's career. Caroline looked at Lady Melbourne and saw the cold heart of the world that would never love her. They were both in their way entirely right, and the antagonism between them would shadow the marriage from its first day to its last. William had been raised at her knee to be ambitious, rational, and unsentimental, and on the surface he was all three. The courtship between William Lamb and Caroline Ponsonby has the quality, when you look back at it, of two people each falling in love with what they themselves were not. To Caroline, all fire and feeling, William's cool, clever steadiness must have seemed like safe harbour, like a man solid enough to hold her when her own moods threatened to carry her away. To William, all irony and reserve, Caroline's blazing vivid aliveness must have seemed like a window flung open in a stuffy room, like feeling itself made flesh, intoxicating precisely because he kept his own so carefully in check. They talked for hours. They read together, argued together, struck sparks off one another, and each found in the other a mind quick enough to keep up, which in that shallow glittering realm was rarer and more precious than either of them quite understood. It was, by every honest account, a genuine love match, not an arrangement of estates and convenience, but a real meeting of two unusual young people who delighted in each other. And that is what makes everything that followed so much sadder, because it did not begin in calculation. It began in love. Picture them in the early days of it, the two clever young people discovering one another. They read together, which in that age was a form of intimacy more charged than it can easily seem now, the sharing of a book, a way of sharing a mind. And they would sit with the same volume between them and argue over a line of poetry, as though the fate of nations hung on it. He brought to her his cool, wide reading, and his amused scepticism, the sense of a man who had thought his way to the far side of most enthusiasms and come back faintly smiling. She brought to him her fire, her quickness, her refusal to be cool about anything that mattered, her capacity to be moved to tears or to fury by a stanza he would have met with a raised eyebrow. Each found the other's quality a revelation. To her, his composure looked like depth and safety, the bedrock she had never had. To him, her ardour looked like life itself, breaking in upon a temperament he had perhaps schooled a little too thoroughly into detachment. They talked by each account marvellously, the talk running on for hours, and in a marriage market built on settlements and bloodlines, and the careful pairing of estates, this meeting of two genuinely interesting minds was a rarer and more precious thing than either of them had the wisdom yet to value. That they were not being sensible, they were being happy, which is a different and a finer thing, and for a brief season at the start it carried all before it. Hold on to that, because the popular version of her story so often forgets it, reducing the marriage to a footnote, a mere backdrop to the great drama of the poet, the dull, respectable arrangement that the wild affair disrupted. It was nothing of the kind. The marriage to William was itself a love story, the first and in some ways the truest of her life. Two clever, delighted young people, who had chosen each other against advice and out of genuine feeling, and the slow failure of that love was its own tragedy, complete in itself, quite apart from the famous catastrophe that followed. Indeed, one might argue that the affair was less the cause of her ruin than the symptom of a wound the failing marriage had already opened, that a woman happy and held at home would never have been so fatally vulnerable to the poet's spell. The marriage came first, and its quiet sorrow set the stage for the loud one, and to understand her at all we have to take that first love as seriously as she once did, before the circle taught her to remember only the second. There were, even at the beginning, those who looked at the match and felt a flicker of doubt. Caroline's reputation for wildness was already established, her moods already a subject of family concern, and some who knew her wondered whether so volatile a girl ought to be marrying at all, or whether the steady young man knew quite what he was taking on. But William was not to be dissuaded. He had set his clever heart on her, and his mother, the formidable Lady Melbourne, for all her worldliness, seems to have judged the connection a good one, linking her ambitious son to the deep Devonshire House interest, and to the heart of the Whig world he meant to rise in. There were warnings enough, had he chosen to heed them. Those who knew Caroline well, who had watched her since childhood, understood that she was not like other girls, that there was in her a wildness and an instability that no marriage was likely to cure, and that might, in the wrong circumstances, be inflamed rather than calmed by it. Some spoke, as delicately as the age allowed, of the moods that came upon her, the violent swings of spirit that frightened those around her. But a man in love hears such warnings, if he hears them at all, as the dull caution of people too timid to understand a fierce passion, and William, for all his cleverness, was young and in love, and certain, as the young and in love always are, that whatever difficulties others foresaw would melt away before the warmth of his own feeling. He was wrong, as such certainty is nearly always wrong. But it was a generous error, the error of a man who backed his heart against the worldly wisdom of his elders, and one cannot entirely regret that he made it, for out of it came real love, real loyalty, and a story that, for all its sorrow, is far richer than the prudent match the cautious would have had him make. And so in the year 1805, in the summer, William Lamb and Lady Caroline Ponsonby were married, and the fashionable milieu wished them well, and for a little while it seemed that the dazzling, difficult girl had found exactly the anchor she needed, and that the clever, rising young man had won himself the most interesting woman of his generation. A small detail from around the time of the wedding tells you everything about her and about what lay ahead. Even in the midst of her happiness, even with the man she loved, Caroline was given to sudden storms, fits of weeping and agitation that came from nowhere and frightened those who witnessed them, and on at least one occasion in those early days, she is said to have flown into so violent a passion that the household was thrown into alarm. To William, newly in love, such moments were perhaps still part of her fascination, the price of her vividness, the weather of an exotic and exciting creature. He had not yet learned, as he would learn across the drawn-out years to come, that these were not passing squalls but the early signs of a deep and permanent storm, that the same intensity that made her enchanting in the drawing-room made her almost impossible to live beside, and that he had married not merely a passionate woman, but a woman whose passions would in the end master them both. For now, though, he saw only the brightness, and she saw only the harbour, and the marriage set sail in hope. The wedding itself, in the early summer of 1805, ought by rights to have been the happiest day of her young life, and there are signs that it was very nearly too much for her, even so. She was not yet 20. She had set her heart on William with all the headlong totality she brought to everything, and the day that should have crowned that feeling found her wound to a pitch of nervous excitement that frightened those around her. The ceremony was a private family affair, as such weddings of the great were, conducted in the evening in a drawing room rather than a church, the candles lit, the relations gathered, the bride in white. And by some accounts the strain of the occasion overcame her entirely, so that the feeling she could never govern broke loose at the very threshold of her married life, and had to be soothed and managed before the day could be carried through. Whether the story is exact in its details hardly matters. What matters is how perfectly it fits her, that even her happiness came at a pitch too high to be borne calmly, that the same intensity which made her love so completely made even joy a kind of danger to her. William, steady as ever, took it in his stride, as he took everything with that tolerant half-smile that seemed to promise she had found at last someone solid enough to hold her. Neither of them could have guessed in the candlelight of that summer evening how heavy a thing they had each just promised to carry, nor how soon the carrying would begin. For the early part of their marriage, the promise seemed real. They were happy, or happy enough, in the intense, quarrelsome, passionate way of two people who feel things keenly and have not yet learned the limits of one another's patience. They set up their life together within the orbit of his family, at the lamb seat at Brocket Hall and in their London house, and they were, for a season, one of the bright young couples of political society, he beginning to make his mark, she dazzling the drawing rooms with her wit and her strangeness. That together placed her at the very heart of the political set, for the Lambs were Whigs to the bone, and the Whig cause in those years was a passion and an identity as much as a set of opinions. This was the party of the great Charles James Fox, lately dead and already half a legend, the party of reform and liberty and opposition to the long power of the Crown and its ministers, and to be a hostess in that interest was to wield a real, if unofficial, kind of influence. The dinners she presided over were not idle entertainments, but the machinery of politics itself, the place where alliances were sealed and strategies hatched, and the fortunes of men decided over the wine. William was finding his feet in the House of Commons, learning the slow, patient craft of the rising politician, and a clever wife who could gather the right people and keep the talk flowing was an asset of real value to such a man. For a while Caroline played the part with brilliance. Her quickness, her reading, her gift for drawing people out and striking sparks of conversation, all of it served her here, and there were evenings when she shone exactly as the world wished a political wife to shine. But politics is a game of patience and calculation, and the long view of saying the measured thing and biding one's time, and patience and calculation were the two qualities most foreign to her nature. The role required precisely the governed self she did not possess, and beneath the brilliant surface of those early successes, the strain was already telling, the effort of being daily what she was not built to be. Brocket Hall sat in its green park in Hertfordshire, a handsome red brick house by a curving lake, the kind of place that ought to have made a perfect frame for a happy marriage, and that would, in the end, become the lonely stage of Caroline's long decline. In those first years, though, it was simply home, and one can picture them there in the early bright time, riding out across the park, reading aloud to one another in the evenings, the clever young husband with his books and his ambitions, the dazzling young wife with her poetry and her moods, the complete sad future still unwritten. London was the other pole of their life, the house in town from which William pursued his rising political career, and Caroline her dazzling social one, and between the two, the country quiet and the city glitter, they lived the enviable life of a brilliant young couple, whom everyone expected to go far. For a little while the promise held. It is worth dwelling on that, the reality of the early happiness, before we follow it down, because the tragedy is only a tragedy if we remember that it began in something real and good, But marriage, as everyone discovers, is not courtship continued by other means, and the very qualities that had drawn these two so powerfully together began, slowly, to grate. His coolness, which had felt like safety, began to feel to her like coldness, like a man who would not, or could not, meet her at the white-hot pitch of feeling where she most truly lived. Her intensity, which had felt to him like life itself, began to feel like a strain, like a demand he had not the temperament to meet, a hunger for reassurance and drama and absolute devotion that no rational man could satisfy, and that he was, by his whole nature, unfitted even to understand. That they loved each other. They simply could not, in the long, ordinary, daily way, make each other happy, and the gap between them, small at first, began very quietly to widen. Much of their married life was passed at Brocket Hall, the Lamb Seat in Hertfordshire, and the place itself tells you something about the trouble between them. It was a handsome house of warm red brick, set in green parkland with a river dammed to make an ornamental lake, the very picture of settled English ease, and to William, who loved his books and his dogs and his unhurried country days, it was a kind of paradise. To Caroline it was, by turns, a refuge and a prison. The deep rural stillness that soothed her husband left her restless and starving for stimulation. The long, uneventful country days that he filled contentedly with reading and riding stretched before her like a desert. She filled them as she could. She wrote, page after page, journals and verses and the beginnings of stories, pouring onto paper the overflow of feeling she had nowhere else to put. She kept pets and indulged in private theatricals and threw herself into sudden enthusiasms that flared and died. She doted, above all, on her difficult son. But the fundamental mismatch was always there, in the very rhythm of the house, the man at peace in a quiet that was slowly driving his wife to distraction, each of them loving the other, and neither able to live happily in the life the other needed. The lake glittered, the deer moved across the park, the seasons turned in their ancient order, and inside the warm brick house a marriage that had begun in fire settled into a long, low ache that neither party knew how to mend. Picture the shape of those married days, because the trouble lived in the ordinary texture of them rather than in any single immense quarrel. He would retreat behind a book or behind that maddening, tolerant half-smile of his, declining to be drawn, declining to fight, declining above all to meet her at the white heat where she needed him to be, and his very reasonableness, which the society so admired, fell on her like a kind of cold. She would press, and he would withdraw. She would rage, and he would grow quieter and more amused. She would weep, and he would wait, with a patience that felt to her like indifference for the storm to pass. Each was, in perfect good faith, exactly the wrong medicine for the other, and the cruelty of it is that there was no villain in this part of the story, only two ill-matched people doing their honest best and wounding each other anyway. He was not unkind, he was merely cool, and his coolness, offered as a refuge, landed as a rejection. She was not unreasonable in her wants. She merely wanted what he had no power to give, and her wanting, offered as love, landed as a burden. Each tried in the early years to be what the other needed, and each found the trying impossible, because the need ran against the very grain of their natures. It is the most ordinary kind of marital tragedy, repeated in quiet rooms the sphere over, the slow discovery that love is not enough, that two people can adore one another and still be, in the daily texture of a shared life, exactly wrong for one another. Theirs was only a more brilliant and more public version of a sorrow that is, in truth, among the commonest in the world, and that fact does not lessen it, but if anything, deepens its pathos. A warmer, simpler man might have given her the constant reassurance her hungry heart demanded, a cooler, steadier woman might have let his reserve alone and been content. But these two, so brilliantly matched in the drawing room, were in the daily intimacy of marriage, a slow torture to one another. And the worst of it was that they could both see it happening, and neither knew how to stop. There was, in those early married years, a great private sorrow, and it deserves to be told with tenderness, because it is the part of her life in which Caroline appears at her very best and is least often remembered. In the year 1807, she gave birth to a son. They named him Augustus, and he was the vast love of her life, and he was not a well child. As the months and then the years went by, it became clear that Augustus would not develop as other children did, that something in him was different, that he would need care and patience and protection for all of his life. In the language of that age, which was harsh and ignorant where such things were concerned, there were ugly words for a child like Augustus, and a society that valued display, and the carrying on of towering names, had little room for a son who would never take his place in the ordinary scheme of things. Many a fashionable family of that era would have quietly put such a child away, out of sight, in the care of strangers, and got on with the business of being fashionable. Caroline did not, whatever her faults, and she had many, and we will not pretend otherwise. She loved her son with a fierce, protective, unwavering devotion that never once faltered across the whole of her turbulent life. She kept him with her. She cared for him herself far more than a woman of her rank was expected to, sat with him, soothed him through his difficulties, defended him against an age that did not want to look at him, and poured into him a tenderness that the rest of her chaotic existence so often lacked any safe outlet for. Imagine the daily reality of it in an age that offered no help and little mercy. There were no schools that would take such a child, no doctors who understood him, no language even to describe his condition that was not cruel, only the blunt assumption that a boy who would never grow into a proper heir was a misfortune to be hidden away. Other families did hide such children, boarded them out with paid keepers in distant houses, and spoke of them, if at all, in lowered voices. Caroline refused. She kept Augustus close, arranged her chaotic life around his needs, and gave him, year after year, the patient devoted care that the great realm would have been astonished to learn the scandalous madwoman was capable of. Whatever storms raged through the rest of her existence, in this one relationship she was steady, was tender, was wholly and unfailingly good, and the boy who received that love was, by every sign, devoted to the mother who had refused to be ashamed of him. It is the truest answer to everyone who ever called her heartless. In her love for Augustus you can see, very clearly, the warm and generous heart that lay underneath all the drama and the recklessness, the capacity for deep and selfless feeling that her enemies always denied she possessed. The reality of caring for Augustus, day upon day and year upon year, was harder and lonelier than any of the tender words about devotion can convey. He did not grow as other children grew. The mind in him stayed soft and unformed while the body lengthened, and there were the seizures, the sudden terrifying episodes that an age without medicine or understanding could neither prevent nor explain, that struck without warning and left mother and household shaken and helpless in their wake. There was no school that would take such a child, no physician with any real help to offer, no kindly framework of understanding within which to place him. There was only the boy himself who needed watching and soothing and protecting through each hour, and a mother who gave him that watching and soothing herself when the entire weight of her class and her age told her to hand him to servants and turn her face away. She read to him. She kept him near her. She defended him fiercely against the casual cruelties of a world that found a child like Augustus an embarrassment to be hidden, and she did it increasingly against the grain of her own unravelling life. holding him steady with a devotion that never wavered even as her own footing gave way beneath her. It is one of the deep ironies of her story that the woman the circle would soon call selfish and hysterical, and incapable of thinking of anyone, but herself spent year after unwitnessed year giving exactly the patient, selfless tending that her own starved heart had always craved and never received. Whatever the verdict on the rest of her life, in the long, quiet labour of loving Augustus, she was, by any measure, good. And it was not only Augustus. There was in Caroline, all through her life, a streak of real and active kindness that the legend has entirely erased, a tenderness towards the weak and the overlooked that sat strangely beside her capacity for selfish chaos, and was no less genuine for the contradiction. She was generous to servants and to the poor of the neighbourhood, took up the causes of the unfortunate, was capable of famous impulsive acts of charity and care. The truth of her was never simple. She was not the heartless hysteric of the caricature, and she was not a wronged saint either. She was a tangle of opposites, selfish and generous, cruel and tender, a woman who could wound those nearest her in 1 hour, and pour herself out in kindness to a stranger in the next, and who contained, genuinely, both the worst that was said of her, and a great deal of good that was never said at all. It is one of the quiet refutations of the caricature she later became, that the woman the milieu would brand as a creature of pure selfish hysteria, was in private, year after unrewarded year, one of the most devoted mothers of her generation to a child the rest of her world would rather have forgotten. But the sorrow of it pressed on her, as such a sorrow presses on any loving parent, and it pressed in particular ways on a woman already so prone to storms of feeling. The grief of a mother who must watch her child struggle, who must give up the ordinary dreams she had dreamed for him, who must love without the consolation of seeing that love carry him forward into a full and independent life, is a heavy and a lonely grief. And Caroline carried it in a marriage that was already cooling, beside a husband whose temperament gave her little of the warm reassurance she so desperately needed. William was not unkind about Augustus. But William met sorrow as he met everything, with a sceptic's shrug and a turning away towards easier things, and a woman drowning in feeling does not want a shrug. She wants to be held, and so the great sorrow of her motherhood, which might in a different marriage have drawn two people closer, instead deepened the quiet distance that was already opening between them, leaving her more alone inside her own heart than ever. By the early years of the 1810s then, Caroline Lamb was a woman in a precarious place, though to the outside set she still glittered. She was married to a clever rising man who admired her and exasperated her and could not reach her. She was the devoted mother of a son whose care was a constant private grief. She was still young, still magnetic, still the talk of every drawing room she entered, and she was profoundly, dangerously restless, full of a feeling that had no proper outlet, a hunger for some great consuming passion that her cool marriage and her careful society could not begin to satisfy. She had been raised on poetry and grand romance, and the dream of a life lived at the very pitch of feeling, and she had grown into a woman starved of exactly that, surrounded by people who admired her surface and could not or would not meet the famished depths of her. She tried, in those restless years before the storm, to fill the emptiness with the things her society offered a clever, bored woman, and none of them held her. She wrote privately, pouring her feeling onto paper, as she could not pour it into her marriage. She threw herself into the social round, the balls and the suppers and the morning calls, and found in them only more of the polished surfaces that left her starving. She was, by her late 20s, a woman with too much feeling and nowhere to put it, too much imagination and nothing to feed it, married to a man who could not reach her, and tied to a society that watched her with mounting suspicion. It is in such a state, when a life has more capacity for passion than it has any safe outlet for, that a person becomes dangerous to themselves, primed to pour the whole accumulated force of years of frustration into the first object that seems at last to be worthy of it. She was a quantity of feeling looking for somewhere to discharge itself, and the discharge, when it came, would be catastrophic. She was, in short, a woman waiting, though she did not know it, for a spark. And in the spring of the year 1812, all of London was about to be set alight by the most dangerous spark the age produced. The London she moved through in those last months before the fire fell was a city at war, and yet feverishly at play, the drawn-out struggle against Napoleon grinding on across the Channel, while the fashionable rich danced and gamed and gossiped as though peace reigned forever. It was a brittle, brilliant, slightly desperate gaiety, the gaiety of a class that sensed, without admitting it, that its golden afternoon could not last, and into that overheated air the poems and passions of the season fell like sparks onto dry grass. Caroline was 26. She had been married 7 years. She had a difficult son she adored, and a husband she could not reach, and a position at the heart of society, and a heart that was slowly starving, and she was ripe, utterly ripe, for the catastrophe that was about to arrive, wearing the face of a famous young poet. Looking back, one can see the complete disaster gathering like weather. At the time, she saw only that her life was grey and her longing enormous, and that something, surely, must come to fill it. And all the while, behind the lit windows and the dancing, England was at war. The struggle against Napoleon had ground on for the better part of 2 decades, and though the fashionable world danced as though it would last forever, the war was the unceasing background hum to each fashionable life. Sons and brothers were away with the army in Spain under Wellington, and the news of distant battles arrived by degrees. The casualty lists scanned with dread in 100 drawing-rooms, the names of the fallen passing from mouth to mouth. The coin was debased, the price of bread climbed, and out beyond the charmed circle of the ton there was hunger and unrest, and the first stirrings of a discontent the comfortable preferred not to notice. Yet within the circle, the gaiety only seemed to sharpen, as gaiety often does in the shadow of catastrophe, the parties a little more frantic, the play a little deeper, the feeling that one ought to seize one's pleasures, while one could pressing, half acknowledged beneath the brilliance. It was into this overheated, slightly desperate atmosphere, a society at the height of its glamour and the edge of its nerves, that the season of 1812 opened, and a restless, hungry, unhappy young woman went looking, without quite knowing it, for something to set her life alight. The tinder was dry. The match, when it came, would not have far to fall. Among the oldest and saddest patterns in human life is this readiness of the starved heart to mistake the first warmth it finds for the thing it has always needed, and to pour into that one object the whole accumulated longing of years. A person well fed on ordinary affection can meet a charming stranger and feel a passing flutter and walk on unscathed. A person starved as Caroline was starved meets that same stranger and feels not a flutter but a revelation, the sudden blinding sense that here at last is the answer to everything, the rescue, the cure, the meaning. The intensity of what she felt for the poet was not really a measure of him at all. It was a measure of her own deprivation, of how very empty the cup had grown before he came to fill it. And that is why no real man could ever have lived up to what she needed him to be. She was not in love with Byron, not really, not at first. She was in love with the idea of being saved, and he was merely the figure onto whom, in her desperation, she projected all of that impossible hope. In the March of 1812, a slim volume of poetry appeared in the London shops, and practically overnight it changed everything. It was called Childe Harold's Pilgrimage, the work of a young, little-known nobleman named George Gordon, Lord Byron, and it told, in rolling melancholy verse, of a brooding, world-weary young wanderer carrying some unnamed secret sorrow across the romantic landscapes of Europe. London had never read anything quite like it. The poem caught the mood of the moment with uncanny precision, and its author woke, as he later said, to find himself famous, the most talked-about man in England, pursued by every hostess in the capital, the dark, glamorous sensation of the season. He was strikingly handsome in a pale, intense, faintly dangerous way. He walked with a limp that only deepened the romance of him, and he carried himself with a brooding hauteur that drove fashionable London into a collective swoon. And he was by each account a creature of calculated effect, as much an artist in the management of his own image as in the writing of his verse. He dressed and posed and timed his rare appearances for the greatest impact, let silences do the work of speeches, allowed the rumours of secret sin to gather about him without ever confirming or denying them, understanding by instinct that mystery is more seductive than candour, and that a hint withheld is worth a confession freely given. In all this he was Caroline's true twin, for she too lived her life as a performance, too shaped her every gesture for its effect upon an audience, too could never quite step outside the drama of herself and simply be. When two such performers met and fell upon one another, each recognised in the other the same insatiable hunger for a grand part to play, and for a season they cast each other in the deep love story each had always longed to star in. The difficulty with two people who are both forever performing is that neither can ever be quite sure when the other has stopped, or whether either of them truly does. Every drawing room wanted him. Each woman of the ton longed to be the one to unlock the secret sorrow of the famous young poet. Across the distance of 2 centuries it is hard to convey the sheer scale of the mania, but try to imagine it. A single book, appearing almost from nowhere, turning an obscure young nobleman overnight into the most desired man in the kingdom, his verses on each lip, his profile in the print shops, hostesses competing fiercely for the prize of his presence at their tables, young women swooning and older women scheming, the whole of fashionable London in the grip of a collective fascination with one pale, brooding, beautiful, faintly sinister young man. The poem itself gave the age exactly what it secretly craved. Here was a hero who was not a hero in any of the old sober ways, not dutiful, not virtuous, not striving towards some worthy end, but a beautiful disillusioned wanderer carrying a nameless guilt and a fashionable despair across the romantic ruins of Europe, scornful of the sphere and superior to it, suffering exquisitely and to no purpose but the suffering itself. An entire generation that felt, beneath the rigid proprieties of the age, its own vague, unfocused yearnings and discontents, recognized itself in this glamorous melancholy, and fell in love. And because the poet let it be quietly understood that the hero and the author were one, the reading public fell in love not only with a character, but with a living man walking among them, available to be met and pursued, and perhaps even healed of his beautiful sorrow by the right devoted woman. It was an intoxication, a genuine collective fever, and Caroline, the most intoxicable woman in England, caught it more completely than anyone alive. He played the part to perfection, for he was as much a performer as Caroline herself, cultivating the air of mystery and melancholy and concealed sin that drove his admirers wild, letting it be understood that the brooding hero of his poem and the man himself were one and the same. The limp he carried from a deformed foot, which a lesser legend would have found pitiable, only deepened the romance of him. The flaw in the marble, the wound in the hero. He was, in short, the most dangerous possible object for a starving, imaginative, undisciplined heart to fix upon, and Caroline's heart fixed upon him with the whole force of everything she had been storing up for years. Caroline read the poem, and something in her caught fire. Here, in these melancholy, passionate verses, was exactly the pitch of feeling she had been starved of her complete married life, the grand romantic intensity she had dreamed of since girlhood, and could find nowhere in the cool, careful world around her. And here was its author, the living embodiment of everything the poem promised, moving through the very same drawing rooms she moved through, available, in a sense, to be met. She was warned about him, of course. Everyone was talking about him, and not all of the talk was admiring. There were whispers already of a wildness and a darkness in him that went beyond the poetic pose. And it was after reading the poem and hearing the whispers and considering this dangerous, glittering new arrival on the scene that Caroline took up her journal and wrote about him the 3 small words that would outlive virtually everything else she ever set down on paper: mad, bad, and dangerous to know. She meant it when she wrote it, as a warning to herself. It reads now like a prophecy, and like an invitation she was quite unable to refuse. She wrote other things in that journal too, in those first days, that round out the picture of how completely she was lost from the very beginning. That beautiful pale face, she confided to herself, was to be her fate. She had looked at him and seen, not a man, but a destiny, the fierce romantic doom she had been half longing for her whole life. And once a person of her temperament has cast another human being in that role, in the role of fate itself, there is no reasoning them out of it, and no escape that will not feel like a kind of death. The tragedy was written in those private pages before a single thing had happened between them. She did not fall into the affair by slow degrees, weighing and choosing as a steadier person might. She flung herself off a cliff she had spent years walking towards, and she knew, even as she fell, exactly what she was doing, and could no more have stopped herself than stopped her own heart from beating. For here is the strange truth at the heart of it. When they were first to be introduced, at a great fashionable party, Caroline turned away. She had decided, on the strength of all she had heard, that this dangerous man was not worth the meeting, and she made a show of her indifference, refused the introduction, walked off, which was, in the small watchful world of the Tun, a remarkable and noticed thing to do, and which had, of course, precisely the effect that such a refusal always has on a vain and famous man. It intrigued him. Here, in a sea of women throwing themselves at his feet, was one who had publicly turned away, and Byron, who could have had almost anyone, found himself drawn towards the one who had said no. Within days he had sought her out. The introduction was made after all, and from the moment those 2 extraordinary, hungry, theatrical, self-dramatizing people truly met, the fuse was lit on one of the most famous and most destructive love affairs of the age. He came to call on her at Melbourne House, where she lived in the heart of the Lamb family's realm, and the calls became daily, and the daily calls became the total centre of her existence. Picture the mornings of that spring, the famous poet arriving, the 2 of them shut away and talk for hours, the rest of the household, her husband among them, going about its business while the thing grew, and grew behind the drawing-room door. Set the scene of those mornings, for they were the stage on which the whole drama played out. Melbourne House stood grand and busy in the heart of fashionable London, a household of servants and family and constant comings and goings, and into this ordered machine the famous poet came calling, day after day, until his arrival was as fixed a part of the morning as the delivery of the post. Footmen learned to expect him. The notes flew back and forth at all hours, carried by servants who saw everything, and said, for a time, nothing, slipped from hand to hand on little folded squares of paper sealed with wax, sometimes a dozen in a single day, the entire feverish correspondence of two people who could not bear the hours between meetings. Within the house, the affair was a presence felt long before it was a thing spoken of, a charge in the air, a closed door behind which voices murmured for hours, a mistress who lived now only for one set of footsteps on the stair. The rest of the household went about its business with the careful blindness that servants and relations learn to practice. The meals served, the calls paid, the ordinary life of a considerable family carried on around the edges of an extraordinary passion that everyone could see, and no one yet named. It could not stay private forever, a thing conducted at that pitch, in a house that full, under eyes that watchful, was always going to spill out into the wider circle, and when it did, the wider world would not be kind. She kept his letters, and he, for a time, kept hers, and what survives of that correspondence gives a vivid sense of the heat of it, the extravagant endearments, the vows, the jealousies, the whole feverish vocabulary of a love that each of them experienced as the very discovery of feeling. She would write to him many times in a single day. She watched for his coming, and grieved his going, and lived in the spaces between his visits as in a kind of suspended animation. To the rest of the household, the affair was a slowly dawning scandal. To her it was simply the truth of her existence, the one real thing in a life of shadows, and she gave herself to it with the totality that was at once her glory and her undoing. There was no holding back in her, no prudent reserve, no portion of the heart kept safe against the day it might be needed. She poured out the whole of herself, all at once, upon a man who would within months begin quietly counting the ways to be free of so overwhelming a gift. They read together and argued together and laid bare their souls to one another in the way that two people do at the start of an immense passion, each astonished to have found at last someone who felt as largely and dangerously as themselves. For Caroline it was the answer to her whole starved life. For Byron, at first, it was a delicious novelty, a woman as reckless and as clever and as theatrical as he was, who held nothing back, who offered him the spectacle of a love without limits. Neither of them was thinking, in those first weeks, of where it could possibly lead. They were too busy burning. Something of that correspondence survives, and to read it now is to feel the heat coming off the page across 200 years. She wrote in a headlong rush, the words tumbling over one another, vowing devotion, demanding reassurance, raging and pleading and adoring sometimes within a single page. Her total ungovernable heart spilled onto the paper with no thought for how it might look in colder hands. His own letters, by contrast, show the practised charm of a man who had written many such, fluent and flattering and faintly guarded, giving warmth enough to keep the thing alive without ever quite committing the whole of himself, as she committed the entirety of hers. The imbalance that would destroy her is already legible in the very ink, her surrender total, and his held carefully in reserve. And there is a peculiar danger in a love conducted so much on paper, for the written word lets the imagination run ahead of the reality, lets each party become, in the other's mind, more perfect and more devoted than any living person could sustain in the flesh. She fell in love, in part, with the Byron of the letters, the figure she half wrote into being out of her own longing, and when the actual man proved cooler and more careless than the ardent correspondent of those pages, the discovery wounded her past bearing. The letters were the affair's truest record, and its quietest trap, binding her ever tighter to a passion that lived most fully in the writing of it. We should see them clearly, the two of them, because in many ways they were terribly alike, and that likeness was the whole danger. Both were brilliant. Both were starved for a feeling larger than ordinary life could supply. Both were performers to the marrow, forever shaping their own lives into stories even as they lived them, casting themselves as the doomed romantic hero, and the doomed romantic heroine of a drama only half of which was real. Both were reckless. Both were cruel when they were hurt. Both could be irresistibly charming and impossibly demanding by turns. Two such people, falling into one another, were never going to make a quiet, sustainable, sensible thing of it. They were going to make a conflagration, beautiful and brief and ruinous. And at first, for a few intoxicating months, the beauty was all they could see, and the ruin lay still ahead of them, gathering in the dark. Looking back, one is tempted to wish she had never read the famous poem, never sought the meeting, never let the spark fall, and so spared herself the whole long ruin that followed. But that is to wish her a different person entirely, for the woman who could have resisted such a temptation was not the woman she was, and a Caroline capable of prudence in the face of so glamorous a danger would not have been Caroline at all. Her ruin was written into her nature, into the very intensity that made her remarkable, and to wish it away is to wish away the whole of her vivid, doomed, unmistakable self. There is a hard truth in that, the truth that some people are made in such a way that they cannot be saved from themselves, that their gifts and their dangers are not two things but one, that the same fire which lights them also, in the end, consumes them. She was such a person. She could no more have walked safely past her destruction than a moth past a flame, and the flame, when it came, wore the face of the most dangerous man in England. And it is worth saying, before we follow that ruin to its end, that the affair which destroyed her lasted, in its blazing reality, only a matter of months. A single season, a handful of weeks of true intimacy, set against the dozen years of wreckage that followed, and the 2 centuries of caricature that came after, that was the actual span of the thing itself. It is one of the cruelest disproportions in the total story, that so brief a fire should have burned so much that a few months of love at 26 should have defined and consumed the whole of the rest of a life. But that is how it is with the great catastrophes of the heart. They do not take long to happen. They take a lifetime to survive, and Caroline, who had never been taught how to survive anything, would spend each remaining year of her life inside the ruins of those few short months. For a season, that spring and into the summer of 1812, the affair burned at a heat that scandalized even the worldly society they moved in, and a society that forgave a great deal did not forgive being made to stare. They were inseparable, and they were indiscreet, which in that milieu were 2 quite different crimes, the first ordinary and the second unforgivable. Caroline made no attempt whatever to hide what she felt, and hiding was the one skill her entire society was built upon. She gazed at him across crowded rooms. She followed him from party to party. She wrote him letters of an abandon that would have ruined her 10 times over had they ever been read aloud. And she lived for those few months, entirely inside the vast consuming passion she had been waiting her whole life to feel, with no thought at all for the watching eyes or the slow gathering cost. Byron, for his part, was at first entirely caught up in her, dazzled by her wit and her daring and her absolute refusal of the ordinary, flattered beyond measure by the helpless intensity of her devotion to him. They were, for that brief blazing while, the most romantic and most reckless couple in England, and they knew it, and a part of each of them, the performing part, the part that could never quite stop watching itself, gloried in it. Imagine one of the evenings at the height of it, a grand dinner in a candle-lit room, the table dressed with silver and hothouse flowers, the company the most brilliant in London, and the poet seated among them drawing every eye, though he scarcely seemed to try. He had a way of being still while others performed, of letting silence gather around him until his fewest words carried the weight of speeches, and the women of the table bent towards him like plants towards light. He ate sparingly, watchful of a figure he guarded with a vanity few suspected. He spoke in a voice that listeners remembered all their lives, low and clear and faintly mocking, and when he chose to turn its full attention on a person, that person felt singled out from the whole of creation. Caroline sat and watched him be adored by others, and could not bear it, and could not hide that she could not bear it, her feeling naked on her face for the table to read. The jealousy in her was already working, the terror that the attention which warmed her might warm someone else, and Byron, who missed nothing, saw it, and was by turns flattered and unnerved by the sheer voltage of what he had awakened. They were both performing, always, each shaping the evening into a scene with themselves at its centre, and for a season the audience of fashionable London watched the performance enthralled, not yet understanding that they were present at the opening act of a tragedy, and that the brilliant doomed pair lighting up the dinner table were burning through their happiness as fast as the candles burned down towards their sockets. Much of the courtship of that season was conducted, as such things were, on the dance floor, and it is worth remembering that the dance itself was changing in exactly those years in a way that scandalized the older generation. The waltz had lately arrived from the continent, and it was unlike anything English ballrooms had known, for where the older dances kept the partners at a decorous arm's length, moving through their figures in full view and barely touching, the waltz held a man and a woman close together, turning, his hand at her waist, for the length of the music. To the guardians of propriety it was very nearly indecent, a public embrace set to music, and they thundered against it in vain, for the young seized on it with delight precisely because of the closeness it allowed. For a pair already half in love, it was a gift, a sanctioned nearness in the middle of a watching crowd, a way to be pressed together, and speak low, and feel the other's breath, while the chaperones looked on, and could find nothing they could openly forbid. One can picture them turning through it, the famous poet who carried his lameness so that few even noticed it on the floor, and the slight, quick woman who had eyes for nothing else in the room, the pair of them enclosed for a few revolutions in a privacy made of music and motion, the rest of the company a blur at the edges. The dance was a kind of permitted intimacy, and like each permitted intimacy in that set it was watched and counted and weighed, each turn of it noted by the lynx-eyed matrons round the walls, so that even as the music gave them their few minutes of nearness, it was busy, in the same breath, gathering the evidence that would one day be used against her. And the watching world watched, at first with the delighted attention it always gave to a fashionable intrigue, and then with a slowly gathering disapproval as the pair refused to observe even the minimal decencies that the society required. An affair in that society was permitted, nearly expected, among married people of their rank. What was not permitted was to be seen, to force the rest of the company to take notice, to make of one's private passion a public spectacle that could not be politely ignored. And that was precisely what Caroline could not help doing, because concealment was the one art she had never learned, and her feeling was a thing that simply would not stay behind a closed door. She wore her love for him openly, in her face, in her eyes across a room, in 100 small, ungovernable signs, and every one of them was noted, and the noting of them was the beginning of her ruin, though the season was still bright, and the ruin still seemed impossibly far off. And here was the trap that her own nature laid for her, the trap she could never see and never escape. The very transparency that made her incapable of the affair's required discretion was the same transparency that made her, to those who could love her, so disarmingly real in a sphere of masks. She could not pretend. She could not dissemble. She could not perform the cool indifference that the rules demanded, because there was, in her, almost no gap between the feeling and its showing. no diplomatic distance between what she felt and what the world could read in her face. In a private friend, this was a kind of gift, a refreshing honesty. In a married woman conducting a forbidden love before the most watchful society on earth, it was a death sentence, slow but certain, and she signed it a little more deeply with every glance she could not hide and each feeling she could not, to save her life, have concealed. But a fire that burns at that heat consumes its own fuel with terrible speed, and the very intensity that drew Byron to her began, with remarkable quickness, to weary and then to alarm him. He was a man who prized, above all but everything, his own freedom, and Caroline's love was not a thing that left a man free. It was total, demanding, jealous, all-consuming. It wanted not an affair, but a fusion of two lives into one. It could not bear a day without him, an hour of his attention given elsewhere, a single sign that his feeling fell short of the absolute. To a man of Byron's restless and self-protective temperament, this devotion, so intoxicating at first, came quickly to feel like a net closing around him, and Byron, when he felt a net, did what he always did. He began to pull away. He had, by his own admission, and by every account of those who knew him, a horror of being possessed, a need to keep some essential part of himself forever free and ungiven, and the very completeness of Caroline's surrender, which would have been the dream of a different and a needier man, struck him as a kind of suffocation. The more she offered, the less he wanted. The more she gave, the more he felt himself trapped by the giving. And there is a bitter irony in the fact that her one great gift, the total unstinting love she was capable of, was precisely the thing most certain to drive away a man of his particular nature. Had she been able to love him a little less, to hold something back, to play even slightly, at the cool indifference the game required, she might have held him far longer. But holding back was the one thing she could not do, had never been able to do, and so she loved him with everything she had, and the everything was exactly what he could not bear, and the love that might in another man have inspired devotion, inspired in him only the urgent wish to escape. There is a kind of love that is really a hunger so vast that no human being could ever fill it. A hunger that was old in Caroline, long before Byron came, reaching back to the wild unmothered child running loose in those glittering rooms, never quite held, never quite secure, never given the steady, unconditional warmth that might have let her grow up, able to rest in another's affection. Byron did not create that hunger. He merely became its object, and no living man, however devoted, could have satisfied a need that was bottomless, that asked another person to be not a lover, but a cure for a wound dealt in childhood. This is why the affair was doomed from within, quite apart from Byron's own restlessness. She was asking him to fill a void that nothing on earth could fill, and when he failed, as he was bound to fail, as anyone would have failed, she experienced it not as the ordinary cooling of a love affair, but as the confirmation of her deepest terror that she was, in the end, unlovable, and would always be left. The letters he sent grew cooler, the meetings grew fewer. The famous ardour that had set the season alight began, on his side, to gutter, and Caroline, who felt everything before she understood it, sensed the change long before she would let herself believe it, and the sensing of it drove her towards the behaviour that would, in the end, undo her. There was, working quietly in the background of all this, a most unlikely figure, and her presence in the story gives it an almost unbearable irony. For the woman to whom Byron increasingly turned as his confidant, the woman he wrote to with frankness about his cooling feelings, and his wish to be free of his demanding mistress, was none other than Lady Melbourne, Caroline's own mother-in-law, the shrewd, worldly, unsentimental older woman who understood the game of society better than anyone alive, struck up with Byron a remarkable correspondence and a remarkable friendship, and she lent him her worldly counsel on how a gentleman might disentangle himself from an inconvenient passion with the least possible scandal. Picture the cruelty of that arrangement, even if no single party to it intended cruelty, and there was a further turn of the screw still to come, for the same Lady Melbourne who counselled Byron on his escape was at the very same time steering him gently and shrewdly towards another woman entirely, towards her own niece, a serious, clever, principled young heiress named Annabella Milbank, whom she thought might make the unsteady poet a respectable wife and settle him at last. Imagine the full shape of it. Caroline's mother-in-law managing the extraction of Byron from Caroline's arms, while quietly arranging to deliver him into the arms of her own niece, all of it conducted with the cool competence of a woman arranging a profitable marriage and a tidy end to an embarrassment. Caroline could not have known the half of it at the time, but she could feel the ground shifting beneath her, could sense that forces she could not see were moving against her, and the sensing of it, the helpless awareness of being managed and manoeuvred by people cleverer and colder than herself, fed the rising panic that would soon drive her past the bounds of all discretion. The clever older woman, managing the situation as one manages a difficult social problem, helping the famous poet to extricate himself from the desperate love of her own son's wife, while that wife, all unknowing, poured out her anguish and her devotion into letters that were, in effect, being read and analysed and gently turned against her. Caroline was not merely losing the famous love of her life, she was being quietly, expertly managed out of it by the very family she had married into, and she could feel the walls moving without being able to see the hands that moved them. And so she did the thing that desperate people do, which is to grasp harder at exactly the moment when grasping is most certain to destroy what they are reaching for. The more clearly Byron pulled away, the more wildly she pursued. She would not be cooled, would not be managed, would not accept the slow polite extinction of the one feeling that had ever made her feel fully alive. She wrote more letters, not fewer. She sought him out where he did not wish to be sought. She made scenes, public and private, that set the whole of fashionable London whispering, and that filled Byron with a rising horror, because nothing repelled that freedom-loving man so completely as a passion he could not escape. And the more she pursued, the more the legend of her wildness grew, and the legend in turn made her position worse. For a woman who has become a byword is watched with a special and merciless attention, each act magnified, every eccentricity reported and embroidered, until she can no longer make the smallest move without it becoming the talk of the town. She was caught in a trap that tightened the more she struggled. To pursue him was to lose him and to disgrace herself. To let him go was to lose the one thing that made her life endurable, and she could not do the second, and so she did the first, again and again with a kind of doomed compulsion, like a person who cannot stop pressing on a wound. The pity of it is that a calmer woman, or a woman who had ever been taught how to bear a loss, might have salvaged her dignity and much of her life by simply, quietly, walking away. But walking away was the one thing Caroline had never in her life been able to do, from anything, and she could not begin to learn it now, with her total heart in the balance. There is a terrible logic in it, the logic by which the very strength of her love became the engine of its ruin, by which everything she did to hold him drove him further off, by which a woman drowning reached out and pulled herself further under with each frantic motion of her arms. She could not stop. It was not in her nature to stop, and the watching age, which had been entertained by the affair, began now to be appalled by its unravelling. Any society harbours a horrible appetite for the spectacle of a fall, and the fashionable realm of Regency London had it in full measure, watching the slow public disintegration of one of its brightest creatures, with a fascination that was only thinly disguised as concern. The same people who had delighted in her at the height of her glory now delighted, in a darker register, in the drama of her decline, traded the latest tale of her latest folly across the dinner tables, shook their heads with a satisfaction that pretended to be pity, to be the object of that appetite, to feel oneself watched and discussed and enjoyed as one comes apart, is a particular torture, and it can only have driven her further into the very behaviour that fed the watching. The more they stared, the more frantic she became. The more frantic she became, the better the spectacle. And round it went, the audience and the performer locked in a dreadful collaboration, until there was nothing left of her dignity to consume, and the crowd, its appetite at last exhausted, simply turned away and left her to the silence that was, in its way, even worse than the staring. The episodes of that extended unravelling became the stuff of legend, retold and embroidered in every drawing-room in London, and they have clung to her name ever since, usually stripped of any sympathy or understanding. She did extravagant, desperate things. On at least one occasion she is said to have disguised herself, dressed as a page boy in order to gain access to him when the doors of polite arrangement had been closed against her, a piece of theatre so reckless that it could only have deepened his alarm. She sent him tokens of a startling, transgressive intimacy, gestures designed to shock and to bind, the actions of a woman who had lost all sense of the line that society drew, and that she had perhaps never quite been able to see in the first place. Each of these acts, when it is retailed as a piece of gossip, seems only to confirm the legend of the madwoman, and that is precisely how her enemies preserved them, stripped of all context and all sympathy. A string of grotesque anecdotes to be passed down the generations as a warning against female excess. But set each one back inside the anguish that produced it, and it changes entirely. A woman who disguises herself in desperate stratagems to reach a man who will no longer see her is not performing madness. She is drowning and clutching at anything. A woman who sends shocking tokens to bind a lover who is slipping away is not a monster of vanity. She is terrified and trying, in the only frantic ways left to her, to make herself unforgettable to the one person whose forgetting would destroy her. The acts were reckless and unwise, and to him repellent. They were also, every one of them, the desperate motions of real and terrible pain, and a kinder world would have read them as a cry for help rather than as a catalogue of scandal. Each of these acts, told as an anecdote, makes her sound merely mad, merely the hysterical woman of legend. Told with any humanity at all, they sound like what they were, the increasingly frantic motions of a person in genuine anguish, watching the one thing that gave her life meaning slip away, and possessing none of the inner steadiness, none of the early gentle schooling of the feelings, that might have let her bear the loss without coming apart. Consider, for a moment, how the very same behaviour would have been read had it belonged to a man, or had it not crossed the invisible line of decorum. A nobleman who pursued a reluctant mistress with letters and gifts and stratagems would have been thought ardent, perhaps a little absurd, but essentially within his rights, the eternal comedy of the lover who will not take no for an answer. A woman who did the same was not ardent but unhinged, not comic but monstrous, because the rules permitted a woman almost no active desire at all, and certainly no pursuit, and a woman who wanted openly, who reached out and grasped, violated something the society held sacred, the principle that a woman was to be sought and never to seek. Caroline broke that principle into pieces in full public view, and the horror she provoked was, at bottom, the horror of a circle, watching a woman behave as only men were permitted to behave. Much of what was called her madness was simply her refusal, or her inability, to perform the passivity her sex required. Her family, alarmed and ashamed, did what families of that age did with a woman who had become an embarrassment. They removed her from the scene. In the autumn of 1812, she was taken away to Ireland, to her family's connections there, in the hope that distance and time would cool the fever and allow the whole dangerous business to be quietly forgotten. She did not go willingly, and the going was its own kind of agony, for to be removed from London was to be removed from any hope of him, sent into a green exile across the sea, while the man who held her entire heart went on with his glittering life without her. Ireland in that season must have felt to her like the edge of the milieu, beautiful and remote and utterly beside the point, for the only place she wished to be was wherever he was, and he was hundreds of miles of land and water away. Her family hoped the separation would work the cure that reason and persuasion had failed to work. Instead, it gave her long, empty days with nothing to do but feel, and feeling was the very thing that was destroying her. She filled the days with letters, with the reliving of each moment of the affair, with the construction of elaborate hopes and the nursing of elaborate wounds, and she came back from Ireland, when at last she came, no more cured than when she had left, but only more practised in her own suffering. It did not cool the fever. From across the Irish Sea she went on writing to him, went on living the affair in her mind long after it had ended in fact, and Byron, with the careless cruelty of a man who wants to be kind and free at the same time and cannot manage both, sent letters that blew now warm and now cold, that let her hope when he should have let her go, that prolonged the agony in the very act of trying to end it. Consider how a reputation was actually destroyed in that society, because the process had little to do with open accusation and everything to do with 1,000 silent mechanisms. News of the affair travelled not in newspapers, which dared not name the formidable by name, but along the invisible wires of the morning call and the dinner table, and the endless criss-crossing letters in which the fashionable reported one another's doings to one another across the length of England. A glance noted at a ball was a sentence in a letter by nightfall, and the talk of 3 counties within the week. The print shop windows did their part, for the caricaturists of the day were merciless, and a public figure who gave them an opening might find herself rendered in coloured etchings displayed for the crowds to laugh at, her features just recognisable beneath the cruel exaggeration, and the drawing-rooms did the rest, in the lowered voice, the lifted eyebrow, the sentence left delicately unfinished, the name pronounced in a certain tone. No one needed to say a thing outright. The verdict assembled itself out of 10,000 tiny signals, and once it had assembled there was no court of appeal, and no undoing it. A woman so judged did not receive a sentence. She simply found by degrees that the invitations came less often, that the warm faces cooled, that a space had opened around her in every room she entered. It was the more terrible for being bloodless, a destruction carried out entirely by implication, and Caroline, who could not read a signal to save her life, and could not have hidden her feelings if her survival had depended on it, which in a sense it did, walked straight into its workings as if blindfolded. It would be too simple to make him the pure villain of the piece, much as the temptation is there. Byron was not a cruel man by deliberate design, but he was a weak one where his own comfort was concerned, and a vain one, and a man who found it almost impossible to deliver a clean wound when a muddled, lingering one would spare him the discomfort of seeming harsh. So he equivocated. He wrote letters that a clearer or a kinder man would never have written, letters that kept a door ajar he should have firmly closed, partly from a residue of real feeling, partly from vanity that could not bear to relinquish so total a devotion, partly from sheer moral laziness. And each such letter was a fresh dose of poison to Caroline, who read into the smallest warmth a revival of all her hopes and into the smallest coldness a fresh catastrophe, and who was kept by his weakness suspended for years over a wound that a single decisive act of honest cruelty would have allowed in time to heal. There is a special torment in being not quite rejected, in being kept dangling between hope and despair by a hand too irresolute either to draw you in or to let you fall, and it was this torment, more than any clean rejection, that did the deepest damage to her. A clean ending, however brutal, can be grieved and in time survived. An ending that will not quite end, that flickers back to life with every ambiguous letter, that forbids both hope and the abandonment of hope, keeps the wound forever open and forever fresh. And it was in this cruel suspension that Byron, through weakness rather than design, held her for years. She could not move on, because he would not quite let her go. She could not recover, because the affair was never allowed to be over. And so she remained, long after any reasonable affair would have run its course, trapped in the amber of a love that had no future and would not decently die. Growing more desperate and more unstable with each year, the agony was prolonged. When at last she returned to London, the thing was over in every way that mattered, but it was not over in her, and it would never truly be over in her, and the set she came back to had hardened against her in her absence. There came, in the summer that followed, the single most notorious evening of her life, at a great ball given by Lady Heathcote, and it is the moment her enemies have always pointed to as the proof of everything they said about her, and it is also a moment that asks, more than any other, to be told with restraint and with compassion rather than relish. Byron was there. He was cold to her, deliberately, publicly, in the way calculated to wound most deeply, and Caroline, already stretched past the limit of what she could bear, broke down before the assembled cream of fashionable society in a scene of terrible public distress. But the cruelty of his coldness that night should not be passed over, because it was a chosen cruelty, the deliberate public snubbing of a woman he knew to be desperate, in front of the very people whose opinion could destroy her. He had ways, had he wished, of being kind, or at least of being neutral, of letting the evening pass without a wound. He chose instead the cut direct, the pointed turning away, the calculated coldness that he must have known would land on her raw nerves like fire. Whether he did it from his own wounded vanity, or from a wish to make plain to all London that he was free of her, or simply from the careless cruelty of a man who has stopped caring what his cast-off lover feels, the effect was the same. He took a woman already at the very edge and pushed her, in public, over it, and then he and the society they shared agreed between them that the breakdown which followed was entirely her own fault and entirely her own shame. In the grip of an anguish she could no longer contain, she hurt herself, there amid the candlelight and the watching faces, and the evening dissolved into horror and scandal and the scraping of chairs. I will not dwell on the particulars, because the particulars are not the point, and were never anyone's business but her own, and because there is a kind of telling that turns another human being's worst hour into a spectacle, and she had quite enough of that in her own lifetime. What matters is the meaning of it. A woman in profound mental and emotional crisis came apart in public, and her society, which had no understanding of such suffering and no vocabulary for it but scandal, responded not with help but with revulsion, and drew its skirts aside, and made of her breakdown one more delicious horror to be whispered over behind fans. From that night, in the eyes of the ton, she was not a woman in pain. She was a mad woman, a cautionary tale, a thing to be shunned. The doors began to close. The invitations thinned and then ceased. The precious voucher to Almack's, that badge of belonging she had once taken so carelessly for granted, was withdrawn, and to lose Almack's was to be expelled from the very heart of the fashionable society, marked publicly and unmistakably as one who no longer belonged. People she had known all her life learned to look through her, to fall silent at her approach, to manage the awkwardness of her existence by the simple expedient of pretending she was not there. It is a particular cruelty, this slow social erasure, crueler in its way than open hostility, for there is nothing to fight, no enemy to confront, only the gradual closing of 1,000 small doors, the gradual chilling of 1,000 once warm faces, until a person who had been at the dazzling centre of a world finds herself practically without a single dramatic moment to mark the change entirely outside it, pressed to the glass, looking in at a party to which she will never again be asked. Let me stop here to say plainly what that society could not say. What was happening to Caroline was not simply wickedness or weakness or the just deserts of a woman who had behaved badly, though she had behaved badly and had hurt people, including her loyal husband, and we need not pretend she was only ever sinned against. But underneath the scandalous behaviour there was, almost certainly, real illness, a disorder of the moods and the feelings that we would today try to understand and to treat with medicine and with care, and that her own age could meet only with the language of madness and disgrace. She was a person in genuine distress, failed at nearly each turn by a sphere that had indulged her when she was charming, and abandoned her the moment she became inconvenient, and the cruelty of her treatment is not lessened by the fact that she was, at times, exhausting and impossible. People in the depths of such suffering often are. That is part of what makes the suffering so lonely, and the failure to meet it with kindness so grievous. We should be careful, too, not to reach too confidently for the labels of our own age, for it is as easy to flatten a person into a modern diagnosis as into an old caricature, and she deserves better than either. What can be said with humility is that the pattern of her life, the soaring exhilarations and the crushing despairs, the recklessness and the grandiosity and the collapses, is one that we now recognize as belonging, very often, to a real and treatable disorder of the mind, and that whatever the precise truth of her case, she suffered in a way that asked for medicine and patience and care, and received instead only judgment. To say this is not to excuse the harm she did, nor to reduce her to a case. It is only to insist that she was ill as well as difficult, that illness and difficulty are not opposites, and that a more understanding age would have met her storms with something other than the slammed door and the whispered word madwoman that were all her own world had to offer her. Through all of this, one figure had stood by her with a patience that bordered on the heroic, and that figure was her husband. William Lamb had every worldly reason to cast Caroline off. Her conduct had made him, the rising politician, a figure of public pity and private mockery. His family, and above all his formidable mother, pressed him hard to be rid of her and to protect his career and his name from the ongoing scandal of her existence. And for years, against all that pressure, he refused. There was in William, beneath the cool, sceptical surface, a deep and stubborn loyalty, and perhaps something more, a recognition that the wild creature he had married was not wicked but unwell, and that to abandon her would be to abandon her to destruction. There was much in cold sense to support those who urged him to put her aside. His mother above all, the clear-eyed Lady Melbourne, who had foreseen this disaster from the first, watched it unfold with grim vindication and pressed separation as the only sane course. A separation would have freed William to rise unencumbered, to escape the public pity and private ridicule that clung to him, to make perhaps a second and more suitable marriage. Every worldly consideration pointed the same way, and still he would not do it, not for years, and the refusal cost him a great deal and gained him nothing the realm could measure, and it remains, for all his coldness elsewhere, the single most honourable thing in his protracted career. Whatever he could not give her of warmth, he gave her this, that he would not throw her to the wolves, and in a circle as wolfish as hers, that was no small gift. So he stayed. He weathered the gossip, absorbed the humiliation, went on sharing a roof and a name with a woman who had broken his heart and his pride, and he did it with a forbearance that virtually no man of his world would have shown. It is one of the genuinely moving threads in the whole sad tapestry, this unglamorous, unrewarded constancy of the husband everyone expected to leave, and it complicates, in the best way, the simple story of the wronged man and the mad wife. For the simple story, the one that the centuries have preferred, is always a story with clear parts, a villain and a victim, a madwoman and a martyr, and real life is almost never so obliging. The truth of these two people is that each was by turns the other's victim and the other's tormentor, that each loved and failed the other, that the wrongs ran in both directions and the blame, if blame is even the right word, cannot be cleanly assigned. He wronged her with his coldness. She wronged him with her chaos. He failed to give her the warmth that might have steadied her. She failed to spare him the humiliations that wore away his heart. They were not a wicked woman and a long-suffering saint, nor a brutish husband and a free spirit crushed, but two flawed and feeling human beings, caught in a marriage that brought out the worst in both, even as it never quite killed the love between them. To see them so, in their full and tangled humanity, is harder than to choose a side, but it is truer, and they both deserve the truth far more than they deserve the tidy legend. They had loved each other once truly, and some ember of that love, banked low and buried under years of grief, never quite went out in him. His position deserves a pause, for its strangeness and its decency have few parallels. Here was a man whose wife had publicly humiliated him, conducted a notorious affair before all the milieu, broken down in scandalous scenes, written a novel that paraded their private griefs for the entertainment of the nation, and descended into a chaos of instability that made his daily life a trial and his public life a subject of pity. By each code of his age and class he was entitled, even expected, to cast her off and feel himself wronged, and instead he stayed and protected her, and protected their son, and absorbed humiliation after humiliation with a patience that looked, to the worldly people around him, very like weakness, and was in fact a quiet and stubborn strength. We do not have to make him a saint. He had his coldness, his evasions, his failures of warmth that did Caroline real harm. But in the deep test of his loyalty, he did not fail, and in a story with so much cruelty in it, his enduring decency towards a woman, the complete set had given up on, stands out like a single steady light in a dark room. But Caroline was not a woman to suffer in silence, and out of the wreckage of the affair, she did something that astonished everyone, and that reveals, more than any anecdote of scandal, the real and formidable gifts that the legend has always buried. She sat down and she wrote a novel. In the year 1816 there appeared, anonymously at first, though its authorship was very soon an open secret, a long, strange, gothic, overheated romance called Glenarvan, and at its dark centre stood a brilliant, seductive, treacherous villain in whom every reader in London instantly recognised Lord Byron. It was revenge, of course, revenge taken in ink, the affair refought on the one battlefield where Caroline held the upper hand, the page. She gave the book's seductive villain Byron's own features and Byron's own words, even, it was said, weaving in fragments of his real letters to her, so that all the world might read what manner of man he truly was beneath the romantic legend. And she gave him, too, a fate of melodramatic ruin, the punishment she could inflict in fiction that life had so signally failed to inflict in fact. It was an act of breathtaking nerve to publish such a thing, to hold the most adored man in England up to the public gaze as a monster, and to do it as a woman already half destroyed, with everything still to lose. And it is worth insisting, against the lengthy habit of dismissing the book as mere scandalous trash, that there was real ability in it. The writing is uneven, overheated, structurally wild, the work of someone who had never learned the discipline that turns raw power into finished art, and yet the power is unmistakably there, in the energy of the prose, the boldness of the conception, the flashes of genuine insight into the cruel workings of the society it anatomizes. Had she been a man, or had she been born into a society that allowed a woman to develop such a gift, she might have become a real novelist, might have learned the craft her talent cried out for, might have left behind a body of work rather than a single notorious curiosity. Instead, she had only the one furious, uncontrolled outpouring, written in the wreckage of her life and against the whole weight of her society's disapproval. And the wonder is not that it is flawed, but that, under such conditions, it exists at all, and carries, for all its flaws, the unmistakable charge of a real and original mind. Whatever else it was not the act of a broken creature. It was the act of a fighter, wounded past bearing and striking back with the only weapon left to her, and there is in it, for all its recklessness, a kind of magnificence that her gentler, wiser, better behaved contemporaries never once approached. But it was a great deal more than revenge. It was a savage, thinly veiled portrait of the total, glittering, merciless society that had used her and cast her out, with her own relations and the fierce figures of the ton paraded through its pages in scarcely disguised forms. And it was, for all its wildness and its flaws, a real piece of writing, charged with genuine feeling and genuine anger and flashes of a true literary power. A woman the sphere had reduced to a cautionary anecdote had answered back, at length and in public, and made herself the author of her own story rather than merely a character in everyone else's. Picture her writing it, in the long nights of her disgrace, pouring out page after page of the story she could not stop telling, the affair refought, the society arraigned, her own wounds dressed up in the high Gothic colours the age adored. Composition was the one act of her life over which she held complete command, the one arena in which her overflowing feeling became not a liability, but the very source of power. And you can sense, in the headlong energy of the book, the relief of a dammed river finally given a channel. The novel poured out of her, and when it appeared it sold, and sold again, ran through edition after edition, devoured by a public greedy to decode its barely hidden originals, to match each character to the real great personage it caricatured, to read the secret history of the famous affair from the pen of the woman who had lived it. For a brief season, The Outcast was the most read author in London, and there must have been, beneath the scandal and the cost, a fierce, dark satisfaction in that, the satisfaction of having forced the society that shunned her to hang upon her each word. The manner of the book's appearance was itself a piece of theatre worthy of its author. It came out without her name on it, which fooled no one for more than a fortnight, the open secret of its authorship racing through the town faster than the volumes could be bound. Readers fell on it, not merely for the story, but for the sport of identification, and that sport became the rage of the season. Who was the seductive villain, so plainly the famous poet that the question scarcely needed asking? Who were the grand ladies of its glittering corrupt society, paraded under thin disguises that any insider could pierce in an instant? Copies passed from hand to hand with keys penciled in the margins, the fictional names matched to the real, so that to read the novel was to read at once a sensational romance and a scandalous private history of one's own acquaintance. The lending libraries could not keep it on their shelves. It ran through edition after edition, devoured the length of the country, and for one strange season the outcast woman whom respectable doors had closed against was the single most read and most discussed author in the kingdom. Her words poured over in the very houses that would not receive her. There is a wild justice in that, and she must have tasted it. The sweet and bitter satisfaction of compelling an audience that had turned its back on her to turn round again and listen, even if what it listened to it would punish her for having said. Keys circulated, lists matching the fictional names to the real figures of the day, so that readers could enjoy the double pleasure of a sensational romance and a scandalous exposure of their betters all at once. The considerable personages so exposed were, predictably, furious, and their fury hardened into a lasting determination to punish the woman who had dared to hold them up to ridicule. It is one thing to be a private scandal, whispered over and pitied. It is another to make oneself a public accuser, to drag the secret sins of one's own class onto the printed page for the whole nation to laugh at, and that second, deliberate, unforgivable thing was what Caroline had done. She had not merely fallen, she had turned and attacked the very people whose forgiveness she would have needed in order to rise again, and in doing so she had sealed her exile for good. She must have known it as she wrote. That she wrote it anyway is either the final proof of her recklessness or the final proof of her courage, and perhaps in her, those two were never really separable at all. The cost of Glenarvan was enormous, and Caroline must have known it would be, and wrote it anyway, which tells you something about the desperate courage in her. To attack Byron was one thing. The world was beginning to turn against him on its own account. But to hold up the entirety of fashionable society to ridicule, to put her own family and her own class on the page as vain and cruel and corrupt, was to burn the last of her bridges, and they burned. What remained of her standing in the tun was destroyed. Doors that had merely been cooling now closed entirely. She was cut, shunned, made an outcast in the only age she had ever known, and the novel that had let her speak at last was also the act that sealed her exile from the society of her birth. And yet I cannot read the writing of that book as anything but a kind of triumph, even a tragic one. Stripped of love, stripped of reputation, stripped of nearly everything a woman of her time possessed, she reached for the one power left to her, the power to tell the truth as she saw it, and to make the realm read it. And she used that power without flinching, and the book outlived the scandal and stands today as the work of a real, if undisciplined writer, which is a great deal more than most of the people who shunned her ever left behind them. Now, a bitter symmetry runs through this whole stretch of her life, and it is the symmetry of the double standard, and it must be named, because it is the key to the injustice of what was done to her. In the very same period, Byron's own life detonated in scandal, far blacker than anything Caroline had done. His brief marriage collapsed amid whispers of cruelty and of relationships so dark that polite society could barely bring itself to name them, and in the spring of 1816, hounded by rumour and debt, he left England forever, never to return. His marriage to Annabella Milbanke, the very match Lady Melbourne had so carefully arranged as his salvation, lasted barely a year before it shattered. And here is the thing to hold on to. Byron, whose conduct was by any honest measure far worse than hers, sailed away into legend, his reputation as a romantic hero, not destroyed but burnished by his exile, mourned and adored and mythologized for the rest of the century and beyond. Caroline, whose immense crime was to have loved him too openly and to have come apart in public when he discarded her, was destroyed, her name made a byword for female folly and madness, shunned and ridiculed to the end of her days and long after. The same society forgave the man nearly everything and forgave the woman next to nothing, and that, more than any flaw in Caroline herself, is the true engine of her tragedy. That injustice is worth sitting with, rather than hurrying past, for it was not a private misfortune peculiar to Caroline, but the working of a rule that governed every woman of her world. A man's reputation could survive all but any scandal, given time, talent, and the right air of unrepentant glamour. A woman's reputation, once truly lost, could almost never be recovered by anything she might afterward do or be. The accounts were kept in two different ledgers, and the woman's was unforgiving. Byron sinned greatly and was made a god. Caroline loved unwisely and was made a warning, and the difference between those two fates had little to do with the relative gravity of what they had each actually done, and almost everything to do with the simple fact that one was a man and the other a woman. She was crushed beneath a double standard so total and so taken for granted that her own age could not even see it as a standard at all, but only as the natural order of things, the way the circle simply was. The years that followed were a long, slow descent, and they are painful to follow, and we will follow them gently. Cast out of society, separated by an ever-widening distance from a husband who pitied her and could no longer reach her, robbed of the great passion that had briefly given her life its terrible meaning, Caroline began to come apart by degrees. The disorder of her moods, which had always shadowed her, deepened into something darker and more frightening, and she sought relief, as suffering people in that age so often did, in the things that promised to dull the pain and that only deepened it in the end. She drank. She took the laudanum that each medicine chest of the period held, the tincture of opium that was the era's universal answer to pain of body and mind alike, and that bound so many of its users into a slow dependence from which there was little hope of return. We should be plain and unsensational about this, because it is too easy to make a spectacle of another person's worst suffering, and she had enough of that in life. Opium in her age was not the hidden vice it would later become, but an ordinary household remedy, sold cheaply, prescribed freely, present in nearly every home, taken for pains and coughs and sleeplessness and grief, with no understanding at all of the dependence it could quietly build. Countless people of that era, many of them famous and respectable, were bound by it without ever choosing to be, and a woman in Caroline's anguish, reaching for the thing nearest to hand that promised to dull an unbearable pain, was doing only what the medicine of her time invited her to do, and paying a price that her time did not yet understand. There is no shame in it that should attach to her and not to her complete age. It is simply one more way in which a person already suffering was failed by a milieu that had no better help to offer, and one more turn of the drawn-out slow screw that was tightening, by these years, towards the end. I tell you this not to add one more lurid detail to the legend, but because it is the truth of where unbearable pain, left untreated and unkindly met, so often leads, and because she deserves to be understood rather than merely judged. She was a person in deep distress, reaching for whatever would quiet the storm, and finding only things that fed it, and there was practically no one left to help her find a better way, because she had lost almost everyone. It is the loneliness of those years that is hardest to bear in the telling. The friends of her bright days had melted away as friends do when a person becomes inconvenient and unfashionable and sad. The society that had once competed for her presence now competed to avoid her. Her marriage had dwindled to a formal arrangement of separate lives under a shared and fraying name. Her vast love was gone across the sea, and then, in time, gone from the world. And so she came to her suffering with fewer and fewer hands held out to steady her, until at last there were virtually none, and a woman who all her life had needed, above everything, to be held, found herself more alone than she had ever been, precisely when she could least endure it. People do not generally fall into the slow ruin of drink and opium and despair out of mere weakness of character. They fall into it out of a pain that has become unbearable and a solitude that has become complete, and both of those by the 1820s Caroline had in full measure. Her behaviour grew more erratic, her grip on the steady ordinary set more uncertain, and the society she had once commanded receded from her by degrees and until the brilliant social existence of her youth must have seemed like something that had happened to another woman entirely, in another life. The balls went on without her. The season turned each year as it always had, the same houses lighting up, the same fashionable crowd circling through the same gilded rooms, and she was no longer of it, no longer asked, no longer thought of, except as a sad cautionary memory. There is a particular desolation in outliving one's own world, in watching from the margins the continuation of a life that once was yours and is yours no longer. And Caroline endured it not in old age, when such losses come to everyone, but in what should have been her prime cast out, while still young enough to feel the whole weight of the exclusion. She had years and years to sit with it, in the quiet of the country house, the long, slow, accumulating awareness that the party would never send for her again, that she had become, while still alive, a thing of the past. There were episodes that frightened those few who still kept any contact with her, stretches of wild excitement and stretches of black despair, a life lived increasingly outside the bounds of what her society could tolerate or comprehend. The pattern of it, the surging highs and the crushing lows, the bursts of frantic energy and creation followed by collapses into despair and torpor, is one that anyone who has known such suffering in themselves or in those they love will recognize with a pang. It is not wickedness, it is not weakness of will, though it was endlessly mistaken for both. It is an affliction, as real and as little chosen as any affliction of the body, and the cruelty of Caroline's age was that it could see in such suffering only a moral failing to be condemned, never an illness to be treated with patience and care. She lived and suffered a century and more too early to be met with any understanding, born into a sphere that had words for her only as a scold has words for a naughty child, willful, hysterical, mad. One of the quiet purposes of telling her story now, with what little kindness hindsight allows, is simply to say to her across the gulf of 200 years the thing no one in her own time ever managed to say, that it was not her fault, that she was unwell and not unworthy, and that she deserved, as each suffering person deserves, compassion rather than contempt. She retreated, more and more, to Brocket Hall, the Lamb family seat in the country, where she lived a strange, isolated, declining existence on the margins of the life she had once dazzled. The house that had once been merely too quiet for her became, in those last years, the total shrunken compass of her existence. The same red brick, the same green park, the same lake catching the changing light, but emptied now of the company, and the music, and the sense of a life in full flood. The seasons turned across the parkland as they always had, the leaves coming and going, the deer moving through the morning mist, and she watched them turn from windows that fewer and fewer carriages drew up beneath. The grand acquaintance of her brilliant days had melted away, as such acquaintance does the moment a person becomes unfashionable and sad, and the visitors grew rare, and the rooms that had rung with her wit fell into the hush of a house where not much happens any more. She kept to her writing table through it, scratching out the pages no one waited for, surrounded by her books and her relics and the wreckage of an extravagant life, a figure already half legend and half ghost while she yet lived. There is a desolation peculiar to the once celebrated, who outlive their celebrity, who must sit in the silence where the applause used to be, and she drank it to the dregs, in what should have been the middle of her life, in the country stillness that her younger self had found unbearable, and that now closed over her like water. The party went on somewhere far away, in the lit houses of a town that had forgotten her, and she would not be asked to it again, and she knew it, and the knowing was its own slow grief. She did not, even now, stop writing, and that is worth remembering against the picture of pure dissolution. She produced further novels in those declining years, books that the age received with little kindness and that have been largely forgotten, but which testify to a creative impulse that suffering and disgrace and self-destruction could not entirely put out. To the end, some part of her went on making things, shaping her chaos into stories, reaching for the one form of order and mastery that had never wholly failed her. There is a stubborn dignity in that, in the picture of the half-ruined woman at her writing table in the country house, scratching out her novels while the fashionable world that had cast her off forgot she was alive. The realm remembered only the scandals. It did not trouble to notice that the madwoman of the Byron legend was, even in her wreck, still an artist, still working, still trying to make something true out of the wreckage of a life. And all the while, in cruel counterpoint, the fortunes of her husband rose. William Lamb, the patient, clever, long-suffering man she had married, was making his steady way upward through the circle of politics, growing in weight and reputation and prospects, moving towards the heights of public life. The asymmetry of it is almost unbearable to contemplate. As she sank, he rose. As her world contracted to a few rooms and a fog of pain and medicine, his expanded towards the very summit of the state, and the two of them, once so passionately matched, drifted now in opposite directions, he towards power and she towards dissolution, bound still by the worn remnant of a marriage neither of them quite knew how to end. And what, one wonders, did he feel, the rising statesman, as he watched the brilliant creature he had married sink year by year into ruin while his own star climbed? He left little record of it, being a man who guarded his deepest feelings even from himself, but the actions speak where the words are silent. He did not divorce her when divorce would have been easy and advantageous. He did not abandon Augustus, the difficult son, but saw to his care for the whole of the boy's life. He came when he was sent for. Beneath the famous worldly composure, there seems to have run, all along, a current of sorrow for the wreck of the towering hope his marriage had begun in, and perhaps a private guilt as well, the guilt of the cool man who could never quite give the warmth that might, just possibly, have saved her. We cannot know. But the steadiness of his conduct towards her, across all those years of decline, suggests a man carrying a grief he would not name, doing the decent thing again and again for a woman the rest of the milieu had agreed to forget. To forget? The separation, when it came at last in the middle of the 1820s, was less a rupture than a sad formality, the legal acknowledgement of a marriage that had been a marriage in name only for a protracted time. By then William's rising position made the arrangement nearly a necessity, and his family had pressed for it for years, and there was, in truth, little left of the daily union to dissolve. And yet he did it gently, settled matters on her with care, ensured she would be provided for and looked after, and declined, even now, to cast her wholly out of his life. They would meet again, he would come to her again. The bond between them, frayed almost to nothing, was never quite severed, and ran on beneath the legal separation as a kind of buried, exhausted, indestructible tie, the tie of two people who have shared the entire long disaster of a life and cannot, whatever the lawyers say, be made entirely strangers to one another. It was not a happy ending to their marriage, but it was not, quite, a cruel one either, and given everything, that was no small thing. Whatever the famous coldness of his temperament, whatever his inability across all those years to give her the warmth she had starved for, there was in William Lamb a fundamental decency that the whole sad history of their marriage never quite extinguished, and at the very end, as we shall see, it was to him that she turned, and it was he who came. Then, in the spring of the year 1824, far away in Greece, where he had gone to lend his fame and his fortune to the cause of Greek freedom, Lord Byron died of a fever in the marshes of Missolonghi at the age of 36. The news of it stunned all of Europe, for Byron had become by then not merely a poet, but a legend, the very symbol of romantic genius and romantic rebellion, mourned by a complete generation that had grown up on his verse. His body was brought home by sea to be carried in solemn procession through England towards the family vault in the north, and it was on the road, by the cruelest and most extraordinary chance, that the past came back to claim Caroline one final time. There is something all but too neatly tragic about it, so that one would distrust it as invention if it were not so well attested. The dead poet and the dying woman brought together one last time on an ordinary English road, years after their few months of fire, neither seeking the other, the meeting arranged by nothing but blind and terrible chance. She did not know, when she saw the slow procession approaching, that it had anything to do with her. It was only a funeral on the road, a thing to be drawn aside for and to wonder idly about. And then the name was spoken, and the whole buried past rose up in a single instant and broke over her, the man she had loved to her destruction passing within yards of her, sealed in his coffin, on his way to the grave. Of all the cruel turns her cruel story took, this was perhaps the cruelest, that she should learn of his death not gently, not in private, not from a friend, but suddenly, on a public road, from a stranger's mouth, the last and worst of all the ambushes that life had laid for her. She was out from Brocket, riding, when she encountered a funeral procession passing along the road, and she asked, as one does, whose it was, and she was told that it was the cortege of Lord Byron, being carried to his rest. The man who had set her life ablaze and then walked away from the wreckage, the man whose 3-word epitaph she had written in her journal a dozen years before, the great consuming love and the famous ruin of her existence, was passing her by, dead on an ordinary English road, and she had learned it by accident from a stranger, in a single shattering sentence. What that meeting on the road did to her, no one can say with certainty, but those who knew her marked a change from which she never recovered. To learn of a death so suddenly, so brutally, by accident on a country road, would shake anyone. To learn in that way of the death of the one person who had been the formidable fixed star of your inner life, however long he had been gone from it in fact, was a blow that her already failing health and her already fragile mind could not absorb. He had gone to Greece in pursuit of a last grand cause, lending his fame and his fortune to the struggle of the Greeks to throw off their long subjection, and he had died there, not gloriously in battle, but wretchedly of fever, in a damp and dismal town amid the marshes, the romantic hero brought down by nothing more poetic than infection and the crude medicine of the day. The cause that had drawn him there was the great romantic enthusiasm of the age, the struggle of the Greeks to throw off centuries of foreign rule and win back the freedom of their ancient land. To the educated youth of Europe, raised on the poetry and philosophy of classical Greece, there was no nobler banner to rally to, and Byron, who had wandered those shores in his youth, and made them the setting of his most famous verse, threw himself into the venture with all of his restless energy, and the whole of his considerable fortune. He drilled troops, paid for ships, lent his enormous fame to a ragged divided rebellion that desperately needed exactly the lustre his name could bring. There was real courage in it, and real folly too. The spectacle of a poet playing soldier in a war he little understood, and it ended not in the glorious death in battle that the legend might have preferred, but in the squalid reality of fever in a marsh, the deep romantic genius brought down by an infection, and the bleeding cures of helpless doctors. Yet the manner of it scarcely dented the myth. He had died young, abroad, in the cause of liberty, and that was enough to seal him forever as the very pattern of the romantic hero, and ascend the news of his death through Europe, like the toll of a fierce bell. The manner of his death hardly mattered to the legend. What mattered was that he had died young and far away in the service of liberty, and the news of it swept through Europe as the news of a king's death might, plunging an entire generation into mourning for the poet who had spoken for them. To Caroline, the public grief can have meant little. Her grief was not for the legend, but for the man, the particular living man she had loved and hated, and never, across a dozen years, managed to put down. And the news that he was gone from the set struck her not as it struck Europe, as the loss of a great poet, but as something far more intimate and far more annihilating. The final closing of the one door she had never been able to stop herself from listening at. The encounter seemed to break something final in her. She had carried Byron inside her for a dozen years, alive somewhere in her imagination even after he had abandoned her, even after he had left England, even after the love had curdled into a wound, and now he was simply, irreversibly gone. His story closed, and with the closing of his story, some last thread that had held her to her own life seemed to give way. So extended as he lived, even unreachable, even an ocean away, even lost to her entirely, there had been some part of her that could go on weaving fantasies of him, could imagine a letter, a reconciliation, a meeting, could keep the considerable romance alive in the only place it had ever truly flourished, her own teeming imagination. Death took even that from her. It set a full stop to the one story that had given her existence its meaning, and a woman who lives inside a story cannot bear to have it ended, for when the story stops, she does not know how to go on. After that summer she seemed, to those who saw her, like a person from whom some animating fire had been withdrawn, going through the motions of a life whose central reason had been quietly cancelled. The affair had cost her her place in the world a decade before. His death cost her, it seems, the will to remain in it at all. She declined more steeply after that summer. The intervals of lucidity grew shorter, the spells of suffering longer, and those who loved her, the few who remained, watched her slip by degrees out of reach. Her body, worn down by years of grief and self-destruction and illness, began to fail her in earnest. She fell ill with the dropsy, the slow gathering of fluid in the body that the medicine of the day could neither explain nor cure, and it became clear, through the year 1827 and into the new year, that she was dying. The physicians came and went and could do little but watch, for the medicine of the age had no real answer to what was failing in her, and could offer comfort but not cure. She must have known, through that last long winter, where it was tending, and one wonders what she made of it as the end drew near, this woman who had spent her whole life at such a pitch of feeling, whether she met it with terror or with the strange relief that the long-suffering sometimes feel as the suffering at last prepares to end, or with that theatrical embrace of doom that had always been half her nature. We do not know, but the storms by the end seemed to have quieted. The terrible intensity that had driven and tortured her for 42 years was burning down at last towards its embers, and what was left, in those final weeks, seems to have been mostly tiredness and the wish to have near her the one person who had never entirely let her go. The rages and the despairs and the wild hopes that had tossed her about for a lifetime were stilled now, not by any peace she had found, but by sheer depletion, the quiet that comes not from resolution, but from the end of strength. And in that stillness, with the noise of her own heart finally subsiding, what remained was something very simple and very human, the wish not to be alone, the wish to have at the last a familiar presence by the bed, a hand to hold, a face she knew. For all the grand tragic shape of her life, the end of it came down to that small universal thing, and it was given to her, and she did not die alone. And after so much that was denied her, that one mercy at least was not refused. She was not yet old. She was only in her early 40s, the same age, as it happens, at which so many of the bright, doomed figures of that society seemed to burn out. But she had lived at a pitch of feeling that wears a life out fast, and the drawn-out decline had hollowed her, and now the end was coming for her in the quiet, ordinary way that the end comes for everyone, scandalous and unscandalous alike, gathering her in. She had been the most talked-about woman in England. She was ending as a sick, frail, half-forgotten figure in an immense house, attended by a handful of the faithful, the storm of her life subsiding at last into stillness. A particular sorrow attends the fading of a once brilliant creature, in the contrast between what was and what has become, and impressed on the few who still came to her in those last days. They remembered the dazzling girl who had set every room alight, the wit, the energy, the dangerous glittering charm, and they saw now a wasted woman worn down by illness and grief, the fire guttering, the brilliance almost gone. But it would be wrong to let the sad ending swallow the whole of her, as it so nearly has in the popular memory. The wasted woman in the great house had been, and in some buried way still was, the most alive person any of them had ever known, and the tragedy of her ending is precisely the measure of how much vivid life there had been to lose. We should hold both pictures at once, the brilliant girl and the broken woman, and understand that they were the same person, and that the distance between them is not a verdict on her character, but an indictment of the sphere that could find no better use for so much rare and burning life than to extinguish it. And here, at the very end, the story turns back to where it began and offers a last unexpected gentleness. For when it became clear that Caroline was truly dying, the person she wanted was her husband. Not Byron, the vast ruinous passion, long dead now and beyond all reach, but William, the patient, clever, wounded man she had married for love so long ago, the man who had stood by her far longer than anyone had a right to expect, and who had never, in his deepest self, quite stopped loving the wild creature she had been. He was away on the public business that was carrying him towards the heights of the state, but word was sent, and he came. Whatever had passed between them across the protracted unhappy years, the betrayals and the scenes and the slow grinding disappointments, all of it fell away at the last, and the two of them who had begun in such bright hope were together again at the close. There is a deep and simple mercy in that she did not die among strangers or alone, that the love which had failed so badly to make either of them happy proved in the final reckoning to have been real enough to bring him to her side when it mattered most. We do not know what passed between them in those last days, and it is right that we do not, for some things should be left to the privacy of the dying and those who love them. But we can imagine, without straining, the shape of it. Two people who had begun in such bright hope and travelled through such long unhappiness, sitting together at the end with all the old quarrels gone suddenly weightless, all the grievances dissolved in the simple enormous fact of a life ending. Whatever bitterness lay between them, death has a way of burning it off and leaving only the original tenderness, and perhaps in those final hours they were, briefly, the two clever, delighted young people who had fallen in love across a crowded drawing-room a lifetime before any of the ruin, when the whole of it still lay ahead and seemed so full of promise. One hopes so. It is the kindest thing the story allows us to hope, and she had been given so little kindness that she had surely earned this last small portion of it. She died early in the year 1828, in the depth of winter, with her husband near her. She was 42 years old. 42. The same brief span that so many of the brilliant doomed figures of that incandescent age seemed allotted, as though such intensity could not be sustained much longer than that, as though a life lived at so high a pitch simply burned through its fuel and went out. She had packed into those 42 years more feeling, more scandal, more love and grief and reckless brilliance than most people manage in twice the time, and she had paid for each ounce of it. There is a temptation, looking at a life like hers, to read it only as a warning, a lesson in the dangers of excess. But a life is not a lesson, and she was not a lesson. She was a person who laughed and wrote and loved her son, and felt the world too keenly, and tried in her chaotic way to live it fully, and who suffered more than she was ever given credit for, and who deserved, like everyone, simply to be understood. That she so rarely was in her own lifetime is the saddest thing about her, and the reason it is worth spending an evening 2 centuries later trying to see her total, the dazzling, impossible, gifted, tormented girl from Devonshire House, who had felt everything too much and been taught to bear none of it, who had loved a poet to her own destruction and answered the age that ruined her with a book, who had been the scandal and the sorrow of her age, was gone, and the towering noise of her life went quiet at last. And yet, for all the sorrow of it, there is something in her that refuses to be merely pitied, some unquenchable spark of pure life that survives even the saddest telling of her story. She was, whatever else, gloriously, dangerously, exhaustingly alive, in an age and a class that prized above everything the appearance of being only half so. She felt fiercely, dared recklessly, refused the comfortable hypocrisies, burned where others smouldered and broke where others bent, and if that aliveness destroyed her, it was also the truest and finest thing about her, the quality that makes her, 2 centuries on, so much more vivid and so much more human than the cool, careful people who survived her and judged her, and have themselves been utterly forgotten. We remember her in the end, not in spite of her excess but because of it, because she was too much for her realm, and being too much, however ruinous, is a far rarer fate than being, like most of those who shunned her, comfortably and forgettably enough. Whatever peace had been denied her in living, one hopes she found it then, in the stillness of that winter, with the one who had stayed. She was buried, in the end, with the quiet decency that her turbulent life had so rarely known, and the great noisy world that had made such a spectacle of her went on without much pausing to mark her passing, for she had been, by then, long out of sight and half out of memory, a scandal grown stale, a name attached to an old story everyone thought they knew. There was no famous public mourning, as there had been for the poet who had ruined her. There were no crowds, no national grief, no burnishing of a legend. There was only the quiet end of a woman the circle had finished with years before, and the private sorrow of the few who had loved her through it all. And perhaps that quietness was, after everything, a mercy. She had lived too much of her life as a spectacle, watched and judged and whispered over, every feeling on display, each stumble a public event. To slip out of the milieu at last unwatched, in stillness, attended only by love, was to be granted in death the privacy that life had so cruelly denied her. The world she left behind did not, at first, treat her memory kindly, and for a long time afterward she existed in the public mind only as a kind of warning. She became the madwoman of the Byron legend, a footnote in the formidable glamorous story of the poet, the hysterical mistress he had been wise to escape, her name a convenient shorthand for female folly and excess, and the dangers of feeling too much. The 3 words she had once written about him, mad, bad, and dangerous to know, lived on, quoted forever, and almost no one who quoted them remembered or cared that they had been written by a real woman with a real and complicated inner life, a woman who had been clever and generous and brave, as well as reckless and impossible, a devoted mother, a genuine writer, a person far larger and stranger, and more human than the caricature that swallowed her. For a century and more she was remembered, when she was remembered at all, only in relation to the man who had ruined her, a satellite of his glory, allowed no light of her own, This is perhaps the final injustice, and the one that would have wounded her proud spirit most deeply. The woman who had longed above everything to matter, to be the heroine of a great story, rather than a footnote in anyone's, was reduced by history to exactly the fate she most dreaded, a minor figure in the legend of the man she loved, summoned up now and then to illustrate his irresistible glamour and his prudent escape, and otherwise forgotten. She had wanted to be unforgettable. She got instead a kind of half-remembering far crueler than oblivion, remembered just enough to be misjudged, just enough to be a byword, never enough to be seen. And so the work of seeing her clearly, granting her at last a story of her own, is not merely an exercise in historical curiosity, but a small act of justice, the giving back to a real woman of the selfhood that both her lover and the legend stripped from her. It has taken a long time, and a deep change in how we see such things, to begin to give her back to herself. The recovery of her, such as it is, has come slowly and from scattered quarters, and it is far from complete even now. It has come from biographers willing to look past the anecdotes to the suffering human being beneath them. It has come from a changed understanding of the mind, which lets us read her storms as illness rather than wickedness. It has come from a changed understanding between men and women, which lets us see the double standard that destroyed her for what it was. And it has come, above all, from a simple willingness to grant her the thing her own age so completely denied her, which is to be taken seriously, as a person, rather than a warning. A woman who lived and felt and wrote and loved and suffered and was, for all her undoubted faults, a great deal more sinned against than sinning. It is a modest sort of justice, this late and partial seeing clearly, and it comes far too late to do her any good. But it is the only kind of justice the dead can ever receive, and she has earned it more fully than most. We can read Glenarvan and recognise, beneath its wildness, a true and original literary voice that her set would never let her develop. We can honour the fierce, unfashionable love she gave her son, the courage with which she answered back against a society that had cast her out, the sheer, blazing aliveness of her in an age that prized cool surfaces above almost everything. She was not a wise woman, and she did real harm, and the people who loved her suffered for it, and none of that need be denied. But she was also a person of rare gifts and rare feeling, ground down by a society that had no place for what she was, and she deserves, at the very least, to be seen as a whole human being rather than as the cautionary tale her enemies made of her. And there is one last turn to the story, a quiet and a remarkable one, that carries us out of her short troubled life and into the long aftermath, and it belongs fittingly to the husband who stayed. William Lamb, the patient, wounded, clever man who had loved her and endured her and come to her at the end, went on, after her death, to the very heights that all his early promise had pointed towards. He became, in time, Lord Melbourne, and then he became Prime Minister of England, one of the most powerful men in the world. It is a strange thing to follow, the steady upward arc of his public life running alongside the steep downward plunge of hers, and then continuing, serene and successful, long after she was gone. The very qualities that had failed him as a husband, the coolness, the detachment, the refusal to be drawn into the heat of feeling, served him admirably as a statesman, where a temperate mind and an unruffled surface were exactly what the work required. The sphere that had pitied him as the husband of a madwoman came to honour him as a wise and easy and capable man of affairs, and the private catastrophe of his marriage receded in the public memory behind the public dignity of his career. He had loved a creature of pure fire and been scorched by her. He had survived, and he had carried the lesson of that scorching perhaps into a life of careful, deliberate, self-protecting calm. One imagines him in his years of power, the wise, tolerant statesman whom all the age admired for his unruffled ease, and one wonders how much of that famous calm was native to him, and how much was scar tissue, the hard-won composure of a man who had once let feeling into his life and been very nearly destroyed by it. He had married passion and reaped catastrophe. Small wonder that he spent the rest of his days keeping his deeper feelings under lock and key, presenting to the world only the smooth, amused, untroubled surface that gave nothing away and could not be hurt. There is a kind of wisdom in that, the wisdom of the burned child who has learned to keep away from fire. But there is a kind of impoverishment in it too, a shutting down, a refusal of the very intensity that, for all its dangers, is also where the deepest joys of a life are found. Caroline had felt too much and been ruined by it. William felt too little, or taught himself to, and was safe and successful, and one cannot help suspecting a good deal lonelier in his heart than his serene public face ever allowed the realm to see. There is a cost to such calm as Caroline had spent her life trying to tell him, but it carried him to the top of the circle, and it would, in the end, make him exactly the man a frightened new queen would need. And in the year 1837, when an old king died and a girl of 18 came unexpectedly to the throne, it fell to this same William Lamb to stand beside the young Queen Victoria as her first minister, her guide, her teacher in the difficult art of being a sovereign, and the two of them formed one of the most touching attachments in the history of the monarchy, the worldly aging statesman and the bright untried girl who came to depend on him utterly and to love him like a father. He taught her, gently and patiently, the things a sovereign must know, sat with her for hours, answered her endless questions, soothed her fears, became the still centre of her bewildering new world, and Victoria, who had grown up starved of affection in a difficult household, fastened upon this kind, clever older man with all the trust of a daughter. For a few years they were practically inseparable, the Queen and her First Minister, and the attachment between them is one of the tenderest things in the long history of the Crown, and it is impossible, knowing what came before, not to see the shadow of Caroline falling across it. Here at last was the steady, patient, fatherly warmth that he had never been able to give his wife, given freely now to another young woman in need of exactly that. Perhaps he had learned it painfully too late in the protracted hard years with Caroline. Perhaps the Queen received, unknowing, the gentleness that a dead and half-forgotten woman had begged for and been denied. We cannot know, but the symmetry is there, quiet and aching, the warmth withheld from the one and poured out upon the other, and it is the last and strangest echo of Caroline Lamb in the history of England. There is something almost unbearably poignant in that, when you set it beside where his story began. Think of the long road that had carried him there, from the brilliant young man who had married a creature of pure fire and watched her burn herself away, through the years of public humiliation and private grief, through the slow climb to power that ran alongside her slow descent into ruin, to this, the summit of his life, the trusted guide of a young queen who adored him. He had buried Caroline and risen to the very top of the world, and one wonders whether, in the quiet moments between the Queen's questions, the ghost of his dead wife ever crossed his mind, the wild girl he had loved so long ago in the bright beginning before everything went wrong. He had learned, at terrible cost, what feeling could do to a life, and he had built his later self in careful reaction against it, and now that careful, gentle, fatherly self was exactly what a frightened young sovereign needed. The lesson Caroline had taught him, the lesson her ruin had burned into him, he spent on Victoria, who never knew the price at which it had been bought, or the woman whose entire tragic life had, in a sense, prepared the man who now so kindly steadied hers. So let the candles of those fierce Whig houses burn down low now. Let the music of the lengthy-ago balls fade into the quiet, and the carriages roll away into the dark, and the brilliant, reckless crowd of them, Caroline and Byron and William and all the dazzling doomed company of that vanished milieu settle at last into the stillness of the past where they belong. She has had her 2 centuries of being a warning and a punchline. Think of how many lives are reduced by the careless shorthand of history to a single phrase, a single scandal, a single moment that swallows everything else they ever were. A woman lives 42 years, loves and grieves and creates and endures, raises a son against the cruelty of her age, writes books, feels the whole set keenly, suffers an illness no one could name, and at the end of it all, she is remembered for 3 words she wrote about a man, and for the spectacle of her ruin, and for nothing else at all. That is what history did to Caroline, flattening a complete complex burning human life into a cautionary anecdote, a name to raise an eyebrow at. The mad woman in the great poet's story, and the small quiet work of an evening like this one, is simply to push back, gently, against that flattening, to insist that there was a whole person there, larger and stranger and more human than the legend, and that she deserves 200 years too late to be remembered as she actually was, in all her brightness and all her sorrow, rather than as the convenient shadow that history made of her. She is allowed now, in the small private hour that closes every life and each story, to be simply herself, the gifted, vivid, suffering girl who felt the world too much and was never taught how to bear it. Asleep at last, her storms all stilled, with nothing left that she must feel or fear or perform. If you have stayed with me all the way to the end of her short and turbulent life, then thank you for keeping me company through the few hours we have spent together. I hope she stays with you a little, the real woman beneath the legend, the next time you hear those 3 famous words and think you know all of her story. If these long evenings in other centuries are something you would like to find your way back to, you are welcome to subscribe, and another life, another age, another candlelit society will be waiting whenever you want it. There is no hurry. There never is. Sleep well, stay warm, be kind to the people in your house, and I will see you in the next one. Good night.